Good afternoon, everyone. We'll call this meeting to order for the Planning Environment Committee on September the 25th. Looking to colleagues for disclosures of pecuniary interest. Mayor Brown.
Thank you, Chair. Item 5, the staff report application by Bantam Developments. I have an interest in a property within the distribution area.
All right. Any others? Okay, seeing none, I've got a conflict to disclose on agenda item number 2, the application of the City of London re-property at 391 South Street, as my family owns a neighboring property. Okay. And we can move on to the consent items with exception of number 2. Would anybody like anything else pulled, except for 5 also would be pulled? 8 and 10. So we'll pull 2, 5, 8, and 10. Anything else? Councillor Hopkins?
I just have a question on 7. You could pull it if you
Question?
like. Yeah, just a question.
Would you like us to pull it?
Yes, might as well.
All right. So we'll take a motion on the balance. 3, 4, 6, 9. Was it good? Any speakers on these items? Okay, seeing none, we'll call the question.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 6-0.
And for agenda item number 2, I'll defer the chair over to Councillor Turner.
Good afternoon, committee. Does anybody wish to hear anything on number 2 or proceed to vote? Seeing nothing, I will take a motion to approve. Moved by Councillor Cassidy, seconded by Councillor Hopkins. Call for question.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 5 with 1 recused.
Thank you. I'll pass the helm back over to our chair.
Thank you, Councillor. Very efficient job. On to item number 5. There's a disclosure of interest on that. Would anyone have any questions or anything for staff before we? Okay, we'll take a motion. So nothing further, we'll call the question.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 5 with 1 recused.
Thank you. On to agenda item number 7. Councillor Hopkins had pulled that. Councillor Hopkins?
Thank you, Madam Chair. And through you, just a question to staff. I know this is phase 5 of this development in Ward 9 that's been going on for a number of years. And I understand this is about the water looping and a second access being constructed. And we're just lifting that holding provision to make sure and allow for that. My question is that I know there's been concerns in that area about water and a bit of flooding and erosion, and just wanted to get staff's comments if they've received anything through this process about the concerns of flooding and water.
Who's going to take a crack at that one?
Through the chair, just Mr. Abousheda is just taking a look. To our knowledge, we haven't received any comments related to that, but we'll take a look and we'll follow up before council if there are any issues.
Okay, we can take a motion on item number 7. Thank you. Moved and seconded. Anything further? Seeing none, we'll call the question.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 6-0.
Okay, on to item number 8, the staff report on the London Invasive Plant Management Strategy, pulled by Councillor Turner. Take it away.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Through you, I just had some questions with respect to, I think this is a good initiative. I think actually we've had a lot of discussion about proper referral of off-budget items to the budget year updates, and so this is going to the right place. I think that's very helpful. We did make the policy change with respect to the woodland the Woodland Acquisition Fund and how we can use that. I don't necessarily see that as the opportunity for everything in this. I think there's some places and opportunities where we might want to start to try and harmonize perhaps some of our subdivision agreements, our road maintenance agreements, our road maintenance contracts and things like that. So would we be using, is the proposal here to use the Woodland Acquisition Fund funds for environmentally significant areas alone, or for other areas as well? Or are there opportunities, I guess, to change subdivision agreements so that they have some management requirements written into the agreement for their ESAs that they abut, or the stormwater management ponds? And in roadworks, where we do those, I think the VMP was mentioned in the report as well. Not really an ESA, and so using woodland funds seems like an interesting part 2. And one more part to that, I'm asking a ton of questions all at once. The last one is a reserve fund isn't really a good source for operational dollars. Not bad for one-time expenses, but in an operational expense, I don't know if that's necessarily appropriate. So if we're looking at a multi-year strategy, how does that all apply in this circumstance?
Here. Mr. McPherson?
Thank you, through the chair. All good questions, and certainly a lot of those same questions that the finance people asked when we started looking at this report and the ways to make this happen. And you're quite right. The idea is that some of this is tied to natural areas, and certainly the reserve has been set up and amended to allow us to manage the woodlands that we receive through that process, but it certainly can't be used for everything. So we want to make sure that when the business case does go in, we've kind of flagged all of those possibilities. You're also correct that when we started this, part of this process that Mr. McKay led, and he's here for more technical questions if need be, we did sit down with the people in the stormwater management group, and they were quite helpful and forthcoming, saying that if the problem is in a stormwater management plan, a pond, that they would be able to work with us through their processes to help solve that problem, not necessarily using outside funding from a reserve fund. Similarly with roadside operations, parks operations, to make this more of a standard operational task for all of those groups and not make it a special project, because you're right, this isn't something that's a one-time project. It does have to continue on. The benefit of the reserve fund, it is something that is funded yearly. So it does have a stream of money coming into it specifically for this purpose. So if we can certainly focus some of this money towards this, that seems like a good investment of the dollars, and the more we can do sooner, the less it will cost in the long run.
If I could just add to that, this gets us to the next multi-year budget process, and that would be the opportunity for us to look at it a little bit more systematically in some of those considerations around which budget should we be either establishing or be utilizing in order to deal with this on a longer term operational basis.
Thank you. I appreciate that. That's helpful. And through you, Madam Chair, then it would be reasonable and possible to look at amending subdivision agreements as we take on new ones as sources of financing for management of those areas adjacent to it.
Through you, Madam Chair, that's something that we could be looking at. We are contemplating, we are not contemplating, we are going to be engaging in a review of our draft plan conditions and subdivision agreements this fall and into the spring as well, so we can take that feedback that you've provided and see what the discussion holds on that.
Excellent, that's great news. And then one last, I guess two last kind of questions, I'll put them together. One, we talked about clean equipment policies, and those would be both for contractors and for our own staff, and like whether that's parks or roads operations, I'd imagine. And the other part is how effective have our invasive strategies been so far, is particularly the ones that we've gone in earnest, whether that's buckthorn or something like that. My worry ultimately is that we're just kind of scooping sand because they move in so quickly. Do we have a lot of promise with, at $500,000 of being effective and actually making a net positive impact rather than just kind of stemming the tide?
Yeah, through the chair, I would say for the clean equipment protocol, that's still a work in progress. That's something that's a next step that we want to really develop a plan for. So it sounds good to do in principle, but implementing it and having everybody be consistent with it is a difficult point. So that requires a specific plan that will come from the Phragmites working group for how we would implement that for ourselves, but also for the development side of it as well. To your second question about cost, and it's about a sustained effort. Just doing it one time here and there, it is sifting sands around. But with the sustained effort, you can go back to a site. This includes provisions to monitor those sites, follow up with those sites so that we make sure that an area is eradicated and we continue on. And as you do that, you actually do beat back the tide of it and prevent further invasions from starting. And so with that, over the long term, you actually have a very net positive effect from those efforts. But if you only do it for a couple years and then stop, then you'll run into that problem. It has to be a long-term plan.
Thank you, very much appreciated.
Councillor Hopkins and then Cassidy.
Thank you. I appreciate the report, and thank you for mentioning the budget, because it will be interesting to understand what the long-term plan for the budget will be and how you're going to be looking at that. I know Phragmites is what you're going to probably be starting with, and that's a big project in itself. So looking forward to the plan coming back to us. I do have a question. I understand most of this is on city property, but are there any ideas about private property, how invasive species are going to have you looked at that, or can we expect a recommendation coming back to look at private property? I know it would be quite interesting to compare the public and the private property and see where if there's a lot of invasive species and how much and where the concerns are.
Mr. McKay or McPherson?
Sure, through the chair. That's a very good point. Certainly we're going to start with the public lands because that's what we have control over, but we can't just stop at an imaginary property line. The good news is that the Western already has a program that they're starting to work on for invasive species on their lands. And of course, they run right along the Thames. So we have been talking to them about that kind of coordinated effort. We may be able to reach out to the other large landowners, perhaps the hospitals, et cetera. One of the directions is specifically to look at vacant lands. It follows, I think it's direction number 6, to expand onto private property. And there's no point in doing our side of a line if it hasn't happened on the other side. So there may have to be a process that has some kind of incentives or some kind of process where volunteers can do it on private property with the right supervision. That's perhaps a longer term goal. We'll start with the lands that we have control over.
Well, I'll look forward to the private part coming back in the future. I know I have problems with buckthorn, for instance, and Reforest London has a program there where you can buy a pick or a digger, and because you got to get into that root system, because if you don't, it just comes right back. And it's a good program if anyone's looking for a puller or a digger, whatever they're called. Those are important things, because I think the community doesn't understand how invasive these species, the buckthorn in particular, can be. My last question I have is around, I guess the Thames Valley Corridor and the implementation of the Thames Valley Corridor. I guess it's sort of recommended in number 4 under the recommendations coming from the study that the corridor, that we look into the action plan. Is it specific to just the invasive species part, or are we implementing the whole plan?
Through the chair, this specific direction is just about the ecological goals that were in the Thames Valley Corridor Plan, and there were a couple dozen of them, and we kind of pulled those out into a eco-action plan. A lot of them have to do with invasive species, because quite a bit of the Thames Corridor isn't ESA. It isn't necessarily even woodlands classified that way, but they're still affecting the riparian zone along the Thames. So we wanted to pull that out as an individual recommendation, because we're going to tackle ESAs, woodlands, wetlands, but that was a bit of a gap in the natural heritage system. So, and we already have recommendations from that plan to work from.
And by approving this recommendation, we're, like you said, specific to the invasive species, we're not really implementing the whole plan itself. Thank you for that clarification.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Cassidy.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and through you to staff. I want to go back to the funding of this. So we already, I'm kind of going to go all over the place, so if I'm revealing my ignorance on the subject, please forgive me. But I know as part of the Thames, I think, as part of the Thames Valley Corridor Plan, we're working with, at least in Ward 5, your staff are working with the Conservation Authority, the Upper Thames Conservation Authority, and they're sort of spearheading the naturalization of certain paths and ESAs in the area. Does that include eradication of invasive species, that part of the plan?
It can overlap. Generally, if the Conservation Authority is involved, that's because they're working on our behalf in an environmentally significant area. It just so happens some of those do align along the Thames River, Kalele in particular. So if that's what's going on, it's probably a recommendation that came out of the Conservation Master Plan for the ESA first. Thames Valley Corridor Plan was more holistic, end-to-end river-wise, but the ESA plans have very specific recommendations for the particular ESA that they're in. So that's the work that you're seeing is through the ESA.
So as far as funding that work, that could be that area, if we're working with Upper Thames in that area, we could be already funding that specific area if it's involved in the work that they're doing?
Yes, certainly. And they will get back to us each year and say, you know, we're not doing enough for invasive species out there. That's an area that has dog strangling vine, hogweed, various other ones. So they're telling us that they should be doing more to keep on top of those things.
So, and as far as the overall mandate of the 3 conservation authorities, does it include eradication of invasive species as well? And could that be part of the funding that we provide to them every year as part of our budgeting?
That's a good question. I'm thinking of the levy that we do provide to them. It's, I don't think that specific kind of land management piece is in that levy. It's more of a higher regulatory and review process.
Okay, so one last question about the naturalization that's taking place. I know there's been a lot of encroachment around the city, and we've been dealing with it area by area, and we just had Kalele go through this. I know one of the things that in the pamphlet that people received was about the requirement to stay on the path, and this is, I'm talking about not a paved path, just a managed path in a natural area. People are used to that area being mowed, and again, there's been some encroachment where they've planted hostas and other things that they shouldn't be planting. But I don't know if there's been education about the spread of invasive species and how that is one reason to stay on the path. At least it didn't come up in the community conversation that I had in that area earlier in the spring with staff there with me. So I'm wondering if you know, is that in our education package, the pamphlets, when our staff go out door to door and talk about encroachment, talk about the fact that the city's going to come in and remove the encroachment, and talks about staying on the path and the fact that there are managed paths that have to be respected, and Upper Thames conservation authorities can actually lay charges. They don't, but they can lay charges if people stray from the path. So I'm hoping, this is more of a comment than a question, that we can make sure that it's quite clear in the education materials that we give out to homeowners that there's a good reason for wanting people to stay on the path, and the problem with invasive species is part of that reason that people should stay on the path.
All right, anything further on this? Councillor Helmer?
Thank you. It's perhaps a little bit late to be asking this particular question, but I wonder, through the chair, if our staff could speak to, perhaps pick a couple of examples from the priority species. What exactly happens when giant hogweed gets in somewhere and starts to become a problem, or buckthorn or Phragmites? I think that unless you happen to be an ecologist or really familiar with invasive plants, it can kind of sound like a weed problem, and it's not exactly that simple. And I wonder if you just give some like narrative around what happens when it comes into an area and starts to choke out other life, other kinds of plant species in the area.
Yeah, Mr. McKay?
Through the chair, thank you for the question. There's a couple of angles that you have to consider when thinking about invasive species and their impacts. One is obviously the ecological impact. So when you have things like dog-string vine, common buckthorn, priority species, Phragmites, what they do is they take over an entire area and they displace the native species that can't compete with them. And so you get decreased diversity, biodiversity over time, to the point where, for example, for Phragmites, you can look to Rondo, Long Point, where you have hundreds of hectares that are just 100% pure Phragmites. So that can happen to our wetlands over time. And obviously with that, you have less biodiversity, less amphibians, other wildlife, bird species that can effectively use or forage in those areas because there's nothing there to forage anymore, or they can't sustain themselves on those species. Another consideration is the social as well. So for example, buckthorn overgrows along the Thames Valley Parkway, so it actually obstructs views from quite a bit for people trying to observe and take in the area. For Phragmites, going back to that, there's also a safety concern. It can be a fire hazard once the dry and dead stalks are there. You can also have safety concerns for blocking line of sight. Giant hogweed you mentioned is another one. So that one isn't a problem quite yet. We have an early detection rapid response system, and that's something that's in the strategic process in the document that we'll implement for all priority species, where if you see the species, it can be reported, and we try to get out almost immediately to address it. Giant hogweed, we usually address within 24 hours if it's been reported. We confirm if it's giant hogweed or not. A lot of the times it's not, and that's an education piece that we're working on. But when it is, if we can get it before it seeds, they can disperse tens of thousands of seeds. The issue there is not so much displacing native habitat, at least right now, but the safety concern with any people coming into contact with it. The sap is quite toxic. It's photoreactive, so you won't feel anything at first, but if you expose it to sun, once you get that on your skin, you can get pretty severe blisters and scarring that will last many years from that. So it's not pleasant. It's something we have to get at right away. And so that's included with this plan. We're already doing that right now, but just expanding that effort.
Thank you. I think that's helpful. First, in understanding that they're not all the same and sometimes they present different kinds of problems. And also to have a sense of how quickly some things can happen and what the impacts can be. I think the example from Rondo is quite helpful. I know in the report it talks about having, gives us some figures about, we have a certain amount of parkland, of that parkland, some of it's naturalized. We're talking maybe 1,400 hectares. From the research that's been done already, do you have a sense of the scale, the magnitude of the invasive problem now across, say, even just the priority species?
Through the chair, not specifically. We have a more local understanding of species, mostly through the UTRCA and some other work that we've done. And through the conservation master plans, for example, Westminster Ponds, they did a detailed inventory of common buckthorn to show how widespread and dominant it is in most of the area. But as part of the Phragmites strategy, recommendation 1 is to put together this working group that Linda McDougall, who also helped greatly with this strategy, she's leading that effort. And they're actually coming up with a plan to first inventory, to really get an understanding of how many hectares do we actually have across the city, both mostly on public lands, but hopefully through air photo, private lands as well, to understand how great of an extent it is and how long it might actually take to really get that under control. So that's part of the strategic process, to understand what we have and then how best to go about tackling it.
Thank you. I wonder if maybe we just use Phragmites as an example, and if you could give me a sense of how much it costs to be proactive and try and get to it earlier versus waiting until it's a bit of a problem and then coming in later. I saw there's some figures giving a range in terms of the cost per hectare, and there's some comments in there about our costs right now in terms of controlling invasives. I don't think that's necessarily Phragmites, but I wonder if you give me a sense of how important it is to get to it early from a financial perspective.
Yeah, through the chair, with how fast Phragmites spreads in an area, the longer you wait, the more you're going to have to pay in order to get it under control. Small cells of Phragmites are quite easy to control unless you leave them. So it is a time game where if the longer we don't do anything about it, the more we will have to spend down the road to actually control it because of how fast it can actually take over an area.
Thank you. Just to get a bit more specific, like how fast does Phragmites spread?
I don't have specific numbers on that. I might be able to get back to you if you want something more specific, not off the top of my head at least. But I know it can actually be exponential if the habitat is right. So you could, double or more an area in a year if you have the right conditions for it.
Seeing nothing further, we can call a question.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 6-0.
Thank you. On to item 10, designation of an improvement area under section 204 of the Municipal Act. Wondering if staff have any comments they'd like to bring forward? Okay, seeing none, looking to committee or guest counselor. Councilor Morgan, would you like to speak on this?
Yes, I would, and I do have a clarification question as well, but let me start by thanking both this committee and council for listening to the Business Association, moving forward with, under the Municipal Act, with the issuance of notices for a business improvement area in the northwest corner of the city in the Hyde Park area. And now we see that the businesses have supported that and have met the requisite threshold to form a new business improvement area, which will be of great benefit to the area. As colleagues know, the Hyde Park area has a deep and rich history. We've talked about heritage here. We've talked about, in the past, the annexation and the history of the area. It's a Main Street designation in the London Plan. It is an area of growth. It is an area where businesses are struggling to find that balance between the big box stores to the north and the small independent stores right in the Hyde Park area. It's also got an industrial zone. So the business improvement area and allowing these discussions and the supports to be consolidated under one body, I think is going to be very beneficial to the discussions moving forward. There's also a letter from the Hyde Park Business Association, which I'm sure colleagues will want to discuss, with some requests for some bridge funding between the support that council gave last year and the flowing of the new funds from the BIA. When this was first discussed with me, I want colleagues to know that I had a discussion with the Business Association. Representatives are here. Donna's up in the gallery, and I'm sure she can comment if colleagues need that. One of the things I talked to them about was maybe this could be a loan from the BIA, and everybody was for that, except for the fact that we can't actually bind a body that does not exist, a body that is not constituted, a body whose members will decide, and the new board will decide how to spend those funds. It's simply not possible to do that. And so the only option for them is to come forward and ask for a grant to get them between the end of our last level of support, which helped them work towards setting up the BIA, and the flowing of funds in January. Their intent is to hold their annual general meeting this fall after council approves this bylaw, and then move forward with constituting that board so that the city's funds can flow to them, or the BIA funds can flow to them as early in the new year as possible. They've been working with the city treasurer in discussions on that. But this all hinges upon, of course, the support of this committee and support of council to pass the requisite bylaw, which I would encourage colleagues to do. The one item that I would like to ask for clarification on is on item 8.6 in the meeting of members. And it says that a majority of the members constitutes a quorum at any meeting of the members. And so my understanding on how other BIAs operate is that it's not half of 258 members to have a meeting. It's half of those who are in attendance, because I don't know of any BIA that has half of all of the member businesses as well as tenants in the area meet to constitute a meeting of business. And so I would like some clarification on exactly how that works, so that as they, constitute themselves, they're actually following the provisions of this particular bylaw that we're passing.
Mr. Angelo?
I can tell you how it's operationalized, for example, in the downtown London Business Improvement Association, but this isn't a legal opinion, this is how they do it. They provide voting cards to everybody who enters, and they write their name on it and what their affiliation is. And when they do the show of hands votes, they collect the cards, and then they know how many people they had versus how many members they had versus how many people went in the door, because they do the record keeping. So that's how they operationalize it, and they ensure that a minority of people at the meeting are not outvoting the majority who should be voting, if that's clear to you.
Perhaps I could seek just a further clarification. They're not requiring, though, half of all of the businesses in the area to be in attendance to that meeting before they can even have a meeting. Like, that is not the quorum.
That's absolutely correct. That would be hundreds and hundreds of their members, and it's just not practical.
And does their bylaw say the same thing? In other words, what I want to be clear is that when council passes this, is that they can actually operate in a functional way and not have to have, 120 or whatever it would be, 129 or something like that, members present to have a quorum of a meeting.
I think the question you're asking is a question for the legal department. And I think one possible solution to the issue you're raising is they could amend the bylaw if they felt that was necessary, or look at amending it after the BIA is actually created.
Through Madam Chair, again, not a legal opinion. I think the preference would be for the bylaw that's before you to be approved by council. And then after that, then the BIA could come forward and ask for an amendment to that provision, unless Mr. Logan disagrees with that interpretation.
I would agree with that interpretation.
I'm good then. I'll wait for the debate and discussion and weigh in when appropriate. Thank you.
Alrighty, Mayor Brown, then next on the speaker's list.
Thank you very much, Chair. And to the Hyde Park Business Association, well, look at you grow. I can remember as ward councillor in the area working closely with you on a number of community initiatives, and as well as focusing in on, when is the right time to move in this direction. And I can remember, I think we were up at Boston Pizza maybe in 2012 or 13. We had members of the planning staff. We had some members from downtown London come up to Hyde Park to talk about, the advantages of moving in this direction. And here we are today. So Donna, thank you for your leadership. To everyone involved, congratulations on coming this far. I know that it's not easy, and I know that it took a lot of time and a lot of energy. Colleagues, I would be more than happy to move the recommendation that's being requested here that Councillor Morgan has brought forward. It's a relatively small amount of dollars, considering the kind of impact that this new BIA is going to have on Northwest London, as well as our entire community over the years to come. And so I think that you've come this far. You need a little bit more assistance, and then you're up and you're on your own. And I know that we'll be looking have some other neighborhoods down the road as well, moving in this direction. So I'd just like to say through you, Chair, to the Hyde Park Business Association, well done. And it was a long road, but you're here today, and I would encourage my colleagues to support this request, given the significant impact that the Hyde Park Business Association has on our community and the relatively low dollar value being asked for.
Thank you. Councillor Turner?
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I got a couple questions. One about kind of the nature of BIAs, one of the technical aspects I'm not quite aware of. We have Appendix B, which has the objection summary to the Hyde Park BIA, which talks about total number of eligible objectors and the percentage objectors. I think even regardless of objector status, everyone is subject to the levy within the BIA. Is that correct? Okay.
Yes, that is correct. Everyone in the BIA that has commercial and industrial assessment would be subject to the levy.
Okay, thank you. So the Appendix B is really to show that the majority of the eligible entities were supportive of formation of the BIA. Is that correct?
The way the process works is anyone who wishes to object has to file an objection in writing. There's no other record keeping done other than a record of anyone who objects.
Okay, thank you. I just wasn't sure what we were supposed to do with that, but it's for the information of filing that those objections and stating them. Okay. With respect to the bridge funding, the way Councillor Morgan explains it is helpful. I do have some concerns that we've arrived at a place where we put $50,000 forward to help with the formation, and then there's these operational costs and obligations that can't be met. And that's a little concerning out of the gates. If this is done in a way that it is a loan, or if there's a way of during the remittances from the levy, that those can be withheld over a certain period of time. Can we do that in lieu of doing this as a grant?
My understanding is there is funds available in the budget, and there will be a report on that tomorrow at Corporate Services Committee. There is money available to finance the request here. I believe the letter has an error in it. I think the request is actually for to December 31st, not February. Not February. That was included in the letter. Proposed budget November 1st. My understanding that should be to December 31st, 2017. The other issue I believe that should be mentioned is that there is precedent for doing this in the past for providing funding until January 1st of the year following the year in which the BIA is created. And I think there was some misunderstanding there. That was the original intent, that funding would be for a period of time up until January 1st, when the taxation process would begin for the newly created BIA.
Interesting. Okay, thanks. Sorry, I just pausing on this other question here. So the bridge funding. That was the question. Why us? Why is it coming to the Planning and Environment Committee rather than Corporate Services? Is this really a decision for PEC to make a recommendation on, or is this something that needs to be decided at Corporate Services?
It came to, I guess the clerk can explain it as well. It came to this committee because the person who wrote the letter requested it come to this committee, I believe. And it came to this committee because the report on the BIA creation came to this committee.
I'm gonna let the clerk help us out here.
Through you, Madam Chair, in accordance with the council procedure bylaw, BIAs come before Planning and Environment Committee. I'm unsure as to why the source of financing report would go to CSC tomorrow, not today at PEC. I wasn't aware of that. But PEC is the appropriate body for approvals of BIA.
Thanks. So, I mean, at this point, I can certainly understand the merit and the requirement for the bridge funding. Typically, we would see source of financing associated with that. Perhaps that could be provided to us in time for council. I feel uncomfortable putting this forward without that information and the understanding of it. So.
Any further speakers? Councillor Helmer?
Thank you. I wonder, through the chair, if there's someone who can comment on the timing of everything. Looking back in retrospect, it was perhaps a mistake to approve funding that went from November to November for something where we knew the levy funding wouldn't be available until, you know, the following year. And certainly there's a lot of work that needed to be undertaken. I know when we dealt with the $50,000 request last year, you know, there's a whole kind of plan of all the things that needed to be done, and a lot of progress has been made there, but it seems like we almost planned to have a gap where there would be no city funding between when the levy kicks in and when that $50,000 was going to run out, according to the budget that we had in front of us when we approved it. So I wonder if someone could speak to the timing of that. Was there any way we could have wrapped this up earlier or had the levy start earlier?
The BIA billings are always done with the final billing issuance every year, and that is basically done on May 1st. So it was not possible to do this, to do the normal billing process, because the request, the instructions really came on May 16th to proceed with the creation of the BIA. I think it was simply a misunderstanding as to what the year end is for a municipality. A municipality always has a year end of December 31st. And that's all the local boards of the municipality also have a year end of December 31st. And since this was people who were not experienced with working with a municipality, they just continued to use the year end, I believe, they were using for this other corporation they had created. So they just assumed that it could be the same year end, and they didn't realize that the municipal act would require them to be working with a December 31st year end. So I think it was just a misunderstanding. They were working with a November year end and didn't realize that all municipalities work with a December 31st, and all local boards of a municipality work with that year end. So that's what happened, and I think it was just a misunderstanding, simply.
Councillor Helmer, anything further? Yep.
Yeah, so yeah, I think I would probably support the additional funding to get through to the end of December. I know it's Mr. Logan speaking, talking about the fact that the new BIA levy funding would kick in January. I want to just clarify that to make sure that that's the case. And in the letter we have from the BIA, or the BIA to be, the Hyde Park Business Association, they're talking about it going through February. And when I just sort of approximated based on their budget that they had before, it looked like the right amount of funding to get them through to February. And if it's a shorter period, does it also need to be a smaller amount of money? And I don't know who knows the answer to that. I see Councillor Morgan put his hand up.
Okay, thank you. So I know the answer to some of this. I can also say that if the committee wants to hear directly from Donna Spakowski from the Hyde Park Business Association, she's here. I know this because I've been speaking with them as well as the treasurer. The original request that was submitted to the treasurer was for a period November 1st to February 28th, because they were anticipating when the levy money might actually flow and looking for a gap there. In speaking with the treasurer, this is actually, and the numbers are right, this is a smaller amount that gets them only to January 1st, which is why the BIA, or the new entity, plans on holding its annual general meeting and constituting its new board this year, so that everything will be in place, so that the treasurer can flow the money early in January, so that there isn't a need for any additional time. So to answer the councilor's question, the amounts are for the November to January 1st period. The error in the letter is, it seems like it got missed, that it should say the end of December from the original requests and discussions that were happening with the treasurer and city staff. The other point of, I guess, information is that I mean, the BIA can speak to the rationale for the original ask. I can't cover that in their letter. I mean, I think they were anticipating getting this wrapped up sooner and potentially being able to start sooner. And as they approached success and achieved success, they realized that it's the January 1st is the start of the actual year for BIAs. And like I said, they also wanted to approach it the way Councillor Turner suggested, and that's, can we just borrow the money and pay it back to council? They really aren't looking for a handout. Unfortunately, in discussions with the treasurer, it's impossible to bind an organization that isn't constituted yet to force them to pay it back. This will have a brand new board. It will have a membership. That membership will present the budget to council through Corporate Services Committee, and only can that body decide whether to pay something back or loan something. We can't. The current group who's been working towards this cannot bind the actual official body and its budget because that will be a newly constituted body, budget and board of management authorized by council. So that's why you see a request for a grant.
Got Mayor Brown, then Hopkins, Councillor Hopkins.
Thank you, Chair. I've read the motion. I see that it contains the suggestion that Councillor Turner was looking for, the subject to financing being available, and so I don't need to speak any further. I think that satisfies his concern.
Councillor Hopkins?
Yes, and really appreciate Councillor Turner bringing that forward, that we should at least know where this money is coming from, and it is available. I understand this is a grant, so the money will be repaid back to us, and just wondering if there's an agreement or what is in place. There's no grant? So if I can have so once we give this money, it's gone. Other than being supportive of that, as long as there is money available for this.
Councillor Helmer?
Thank you, and just bear with me while I'm working my way through the numbers. So the original letter we had from the Business Association, and I'm glad you pointed out that Donna's here in case she does want to weigh in, requesting $16,861.10. So I look at the budget they had for last year for 12 months was for $64,500. I can divide that by 12, it's like 5,000 something a month. $16,000 is not 2 months at $5,000. It's more than that. So I'm just a little confused about what exactly needs to happen. The big costs in this request are salaries and rent, and I don't get how those would vary so substantially. So it looks like really what's needed is $10,700. So I wonder if somebody could maybe speak to that for 2 months.
Ms. Bezikowski? It's on, go ahead.
Hi, okay, thank you very much. I do apologize for the error. It is for 2 months that we're requesting. When we came to council a year ago, we were requesting 1 year, thinking that we would have the levy monies starting up in the fall when we achieved the designation. So we didn't realize until the summer that we were going to have the gap, hence the request. In terms of the calculations, yes, we had money as well, $7,000 from the ministry in our budget, in addition to the 50 for 2 people that we brought on through the JCP program. So the overall budget was based on 57.
Okay, I'm afraid that doesn't really address the issue. So I can understand why you might have a lower than the average monthly cost, because you don't have necessarily those staff on, and some of the money was paid for by the ministry grant, which isn't around anymore. All of that makes sense. But what's before us is that you have a higher than average cost for those months that are remaining. So like if we gave you $16,500, that's times 2 months, that's $8,000 something per month. You were never at $8,000 per month, even when you had more staff. So I'm just confused about that.
Ms. Bezikowski?
Thank you. So we are paying in that request, it is for 2 staff members, one of which was funded under the ministry, as you pointed out. We also are seeing an increase in our rent by $500 a month starting November 1. Further to that, I would have to rework the numbers the other thing that's in there is that we didn't have in there was 1,500 to help offset our costs to hold the AGM.
That's helpful.
Councillor Hopkins, did you have another question?
Sorry about that. I'm just trying to understand it. And so the 16,861.10, is that for 3 months? The expenses for a 3-month period that we are going to be approving here?
Ms.
Or is it
Wadowski?
for the 1 month?
November and December for 2 months.
And then to be helpful, the levy money would flow January 1 if this is approved by council going forward. Yeah. Councillor Turner?
Thank you, Madam Chair. So on line 2 in the motion here, it says the request from the Hyde Park Business Association for a grant in the amount of, is there a possibility to put the language in there that that asks, if possible, that be repaid? Given Councillor Morgan's comments that the hope that was that this could be a loan, or the potential for that. We can't compel them to, but if the language stands as it is here, then it's a grant, and there's really no request or expectation that it gets paid back as it stands. So if there was language in here that showed that, then that would be helpful.
Yeah, the clerks are just going to work on some language for you for your review. Councillor, your amendment's up if you'd like to review it.
Thank you, that looks good.
Councillor Helmer?
So I like the idea, and I think that's a reasonable way of phrasing it. I want to make sure we're not compounding what might have been a mistake last year by making another one. So can someone give me a sense, perhaps Mr. Logan, what the levy amount is expected to be if it's levied in this area? I want to make sure that the BIA will be able to cover their expenses and actually repay the money if they decide to do that, and then we're not setting them up to sort of next year to say, well, we don't actually have the money to pay you back right away.
Well, the budget will be based on the levy will be based on the budget that's approved by the Board of Management. And I would not want to make an assumption about what that will be. I think perhaps the person speaking at the microphone behind me can give you some idea what the intent is, but the ultimate budget, the budget will be decided by the Board of Management, which actually doesn't exist right now. So I wouldn't want to predict exactly what it is. What we would flow in the first part of the year would be based on the budget that the Board of Management would submit to us. We would flow roughly 50% of that in the first part of the year. But you're talking about a Board of Management that does not now exist.
No problem, I understand that, but all the people who are going to be involved are sitting up there, so perhaps Donna wants to weigh in just to give me a sense of what you're thinking about in terms of the budget for next year and the ability to pay back the grant if that's what the future Board of Management decides.
I would be very happy to recommend to the new Board of Management that we repay the monies back maybe in 2 parts, in the first part and the second part of the year next year.
Okay, anything further? Okay, seeing nothing, we can call the question.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 6-0.
Okay, thank you, colleagues. On to agenda item 11, the Latch report. Do we have the chair here for a delegation? Nope, we do not. So would anyone have any questions or comments on the Latch agenda at this time? Or any words from Mr. Yanchula before we get into? Nope, no one wants to talk. What a day, what a day. Okay, Councillor Turner?
I was curious as to the nature of the application at 467, 469. but I guess we don't have Mr. Dudek here. I took a look, and it looks like some uninhabited buildings next to the, what is the Masonic Temple? Is there an application or an intent to demolish and rebuild something at that site? It seems to be what the number 3 application at 467, 469 Dufferin Ave seems to indicate in those notes.
Madam Chair, there is an active application for a zoning bylaw amendment on that site for a 12-unit apartment building featuring micro suites that we are processing.
Thank you.
If I may, on that, could Mr. Yanchula tell me, when this application went forward to Latch, did it go through the sub-stewardship committee?
The application for the official plan and zoning bylaw amendment? Which
Yes,
application
on
are you referring
Dufferin,
to?
yeah. On Dufferin?
Yes, but an application, the OZ application, is that what you're asking me? No, it didn't go through stewardship. That's not typically what stewardship does. Stewardship researches the historical, the cultural heritage value and significance of properties and makes its recommendations to full latch on that. And they have not themselves conducted that. They have heard from members in the community on the heritage, but they have not themselves undertaken any of that nature of research.
Will they in future, recognizing it's in the Heritage Conservation District?
So what we would ask for would be a heritage impact assessment as part of the complete application that would help us weigh what the impacts would be from heritage versus any other impacts that would be received, and that hasn't, we haven't dealt with that yet.
Thank you. Any further question or comment on the Latch report? Okay, seeing none, we can take a motion. We'll open the vote.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 6-0.
Thank you. And on to agenda item number 4, a public participation meeting for Jackson Road, Inc. We'll take a motion to open the public participation meeting. We'll call the question.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 6-0.
Thank you. Mr. Mottram, whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This is an application for approval of draft plan of subdivision, official plan, and zoning bylaw amendments for the subject lands. I'm just going to bring it up on the next slide, which are identified as 1635 Commissioners Road East and 2624 Jackson Road. And these are the subject lands of the applicant, and they're referred to as the Parker Jackson lands. And they've also been referred to in the past as Summerside East. So the general area of the boundaries are Commissioners Road East on the north, Jackson Road on the west, and Bradley Avenue to the south. The frontage along Commissioners Road East is broken up by 2 small rural residential properties that are existing but exist outside of the limits of the draft plan, and as well as a third property on the northeast corner of Jackson Road and Bradley Avenue. So this staff have commenced with a city-initiated official plan review of these properties, 1663 and 1685 Commissioners Road and 2652 Jackson Road, in order that they could be included and considered comprehensively with the recommended land use changes, and that wouldn't be left as orphan parcels outside of the planning of this area. The site characteristics as far as land use presently primarily in agricultural cash crops. There's also a woodland and a significant wetland on the subject lands in the central easterly portion of the site. There are the residential dwellings that I just spoke to you about on Commissioners Road and at the corner of Jackson and Bradley. And there's also a Hydro One Networks hydro corridor easement, as well as a hydro transmission tower located, and it's in the northeast portion, and it crosses the northeast corner of the subject lands. Frontage is 1,600 meters on Jackson Road, pretty much all the way from Commissioners Road all the way down to Jackson Road, and the depth is generally 835 meters, and it has an area of approximately 82 hectares with an irregular L shape, which would resemble an upside-down boot or ski boot. The surrounding properties to the north are in agricultural use at the present time, with the Meadowlily Woods and the Thames River further to the north. To the south are your woodland and wetland, which and crosses over to the property on the south and east. There are agricultural lands and the hydro corridor, of course, in this area. The east land uses to the east are made up of agricultural and hydro corridor. The lands to the west are in existing low and medium density residential uses and a swim pond associated with the Summerside subdivision. The current official plan land use designations are urban reserve, community growth, environmental review, and agriculture. And in the London plan, the place type delineations are neighborhoods, green space, environmental review, and farmland place types. The zoning currently is an urban reserve, UR4 zone, environmental review, and agricultural zoning. And the UR4 zone is a zoning that basically recognizes existing uses, like existing dwellings and agricultural uses. The ER zone is applied to the woodland wetland patch, as well as to a tributary, open channel tributary that leads westerly across the agricultural fields over to Jackson Road, and then south to Bradley Avenue, crosses Bradley Avenue, and this is a tributary J to the Dingman Creek. It's a open channel water course. And the agricultural AG1 zone is a zone that permits agricultural activities, greenhouses, and nurseries, such uses as that. So this is the draft plan submission in 2006. There was a submission made for draft plan approval by Zed Group, and official plan and zoning bylaw amendments, and the application was submitted for processing, but it didn't get very far until things got held up, primarily because the environmental impact study that was submitted was not accepted by the city. It did not adequately address the impacts on the wooded areas and the wetlands and natural features. So that was one reason. There was issues with the configuration and the design at that time for the stormwater management facilities, as well as the timing and scheduling of stormwater management works to service this development. And another thing I might want to add to is that at the time, a placemaking demonstration project was underway, and this site was one of the candidate site for that project, as well as others. There was a revised submission. Eventually, it was made in 2014, 2015, and that's this submission that you see. And there were considerable changes made from the 2006 version, and it this time included full preservation of the existing wooded area as open space, and incorporating some of the placemaking principles and design concepts that were advanced through the placemaking project. For example, the subdivision road network was redesigned on a grid pattern replacing the previous pattern of closed loops, crescents, and cul-de-sacs. Street townhouse blocks were introduced to provide opportunities for pedestrian-oriented streetscapes, as well as window streets along Commissioners Road East and Jackson Road. We circulated this draft plan at the time. It was circulated to the school board. The Thames Valley District School Board had indicated an interest in acquiring a school site here, and they responded that while the school site was of the right size, approximately a 5-acre site, it was not going to work functionally for the school board because of its configuration and its triangular shape. They needed typically need a site that they can accommodate the school facilities, accommodate the parking, accommodate the school bus loading zone, playing areas, and athletic fields. And so this draft plan was brought back, and we sat down with the applicants, and they took it back to the drafting table to consider some revisions, and that included what we see now as the current revised draft plan. So the school block is adjacent neighborhood park block in a sort of a joint campus configuration in the more or less in the middle central area of the subdivision. And they also included a smaller parkette a little bit further to the north near the entrance, the main entrance off Commissioners Road. So this is the color land use concept plan that was submitted that accompanied the draft plan in support of the draft plan. And I'll just go through this in order of the various components of the land use. The low density residential, which is the yellow areas, it is distributed primarily in the interior of the subdivision, as well as to the window streets adjacent Jackson Road and Commissioners Road East. These blocks are intended for single detached dwelling lots, and the lots have been configured to enable them to be divided into lots through the registration of future phases. There is flexibility in the zoning to provide for a mix of lot sizes. Two residential, R1 residential zones are recommended, that one would provide for a minimum of a 9-meter frontage, as well as another residential R14 zone with a minimum of a 12-meter frontage. The 9-meter frontages would be primarily on the local streets, and the 12-meter frontage R14 zoning would be mainly on the secondary collector roads, but some local streets would have that zone too. So the concept plans that were submitted with this application estimated a yield of approximately 520 single detached lots within that designation. Medium density residential, the draft plan shows several street fronting blocks to accommodate street townhouse development. And those would be the gold colored blocks. Larger medium density blocks are located closer or adjacent to Commissioners Road and Jackson Road, and they're in the brown. The zoning would permit a range of street townhouses, and various forms of cluster housing, including attached or detached forms of multifamily housing. And the conceptual lot plans that were submitted indicated a yield of 142 street townhouse units and 347 cluster townhouse units. The neighborhood parks and the school, the neighborhood park and school blocks are centrally located to facilitate active recreation and active transportation from within the community, as well as convenient access to the local and secondary collector road system. The elementary school site location and the size and the configuration meet the Thames Valley District School Board needs. Smaller neighborhood park is located at the terminus of the main entrance to the community from Commissioners Road East. With respect to the distribution of open space, the natural heritage features within the plan are to be protected as open space, and they include a 25-meter buffer block from the surveyed drip line of the wooded area and the significant wetland, plus a 5-meter multi-use public pathway that runs contiguously with that buffer block. The proposed buffer does exceed the minimum requirement, so therefore an EIS was not required. We had advised EPAC of this, and because they had inquired, and there was no further responses from EPAC because they did not receive an EIS or subject land status report. The park and the pathway access blocks will be in the open space designation and zoning, as well as the open channel water course, as I referred to as the Scott Hampton Drain, as well as the future planned swim facility, which you can see in the darker blue off on the east side of Jackson Road. There is an area at the southerly end of the development which will be held for future development. It's a block of land between the Collector Road Street end and the Hydro Corridor, which will remain for now as urban reserve community growth. This is a phase of the subdivision which is intended for future development until detailed plans, which would be incorporated in a site plan or a subdivision plan, are submitted together with an official plan amendment and rezoning application. There is also a tiny remnant parcel of land over on the north side off Commissioners Road, and it's a parcel of land that resulted from revisions to the draft plan to correct the alignment of Street A at Commissioners Road East. It's very small, it's approximately 160 square meters, but the intent is that that remnant parcel be consolidated with the adjacent lands. And so those two areas for future development are identified by the identified within the red oval. And then the Hydro Corridor and the remnant agricultural lands, the limits of the draft plan follow the legal property boundary, which extends to Bradley Avenue. And it results in the creation of a parcel outside of the urban growth boundary. Urban-related uses are not permitted to extend beyond the growth boundary. And this remnant parcel, as well as the Hydro Corridor block, we recommend be zoned as agricultural within a special provision agricultural zone to recognize the parcel sizes, lot areas, and frontage. And that's consistent with the official plan designation. In terms of some of the design and placemaking features, the plan does exhibit a road pattern that incorporates a strong grid street pattern connected to north and south and east and west secondary collector roads, which function as the spine of the community. There are window streets along Jackson Road and Commissioners Road East with blocks designed to enable the front-facing dwellings to the public streets. And Street A connection to Commissioners Road East provides a main entrance to the community and a focal point in conjunction with a smaller neighborhood park. A larger neighborhood park and school site is centrally located within the community and completely bound by public streets and within a convenient walking distance to all future residents. The natural heritage features are integrated with the community and public ground through the planned park and multi-use pathway system. And several public park access points have been provided connecting the neighborhood to the multi-use pathway, as well as providing access and views to the open space. The street network is made up of local streets and secondary collector roads. The streets A off of Commissioners Road, Street B, which extends across east-west on the northerly end of the subdivision, and Street N, which also crosses east-west at the southerly end, that will be designated as secondary collectors. Street I from Jackson Road to Street J, and Street J, which connects from Street B down to Street N, is the north-south spine, and it would be designated as a secondary collector road on a 21.5 meter right-of-way. Collector road connections along Jackson Road align with the existing roads in the Summerside subdivision to the west, provision has been made for a future extension of these collector roads to serve lands when they develop in the future to the east. So the road network is connected to the multi-use pathway at several access points, as well as traffic calming is provided by roundabouts at key intersections within the road network. Responses from the public to the notice of application that went out in later part of 2016. This is a summary of the main concerns, and it was first a lack of services in the area, lack of commercial retail services and facilities in the area, such as a grocery store, libraries, and community facilities. Issues with it being auto-oriented development. The proposed residential subdivision rely heavily on automobile use. Very few paths through the streets and neighborhoods requiring people to walk much further to homes, parks, and schools, and whether or not there would be bus service extended to the area. And there was a particular concern with impact on an adjacent farm and a maple syrup operation. And the owner at 1944 Bradley Avenue was concerned about trespassing and vandalism, and had requested, therefore, that a chain link metal fence along the perimeter of the subdivision adjacent his farm in Sugar Bush, and indicating that there are maple syrup lines all through the bush. They stay up all year long, and with no chain link fence to keep trespassers out, he felt that they could be forced out of business. So in response to the issue of availability of services and facilities, there is commercial development and vacant commercially zoned lands existing further to the west on the southeast quadrant of Commissioners Road East and Highbury Avenue, in its zoned community shopping area, CSA 5. And this is where the Rona is, which is now closed. There is vacant lands there, and one site there that could accommodate a future food store. But we do have food stores, drug stores, banks, restaurants, and a public library, which is part of the Pond Mills branch, located further to the west along Commissioners Road East, over by in the Pond Mills area. Development activity and building up of the population base will help generate demand and attract more local stores and services to this area over time, as there has been an increase in development in this area. And as well as there's undeveloped lands on the north side of Commissioners Road, which are designated urban reserve and community growth, which would provide for a appropriate site for commercial development with exposure onto an arterial road. With respect to the auto-oriented development, establishing a north-south bicycle route through the proposed Parker-Jackson lands will assist in connecting the development to the citywide bicycle network, which is proceeding and growing in this area of the city. Sidewalks and pedestrian bicycle connections are planned as part of this subdivision community development, which will create direct and convenient routes through the subdivision. And the planned pathway system, the street networks, the parks and school and open space networks, we feel achieves these goals of active transportation. And there is opportunities to extend the existing bus transit routes from Pond Mills and through the Summerside subdivision, which are currently served at this time. With respect to the impact on the maple syrup operation and the adjacent farm, fencing the property boundary as requested by the adjacent property owner would place portions of the fence line through a provincially significant wetland. And without considering the impact on the wetland, a condition of draft plan approval requiring the installation of a fence would not be consistent with a provincial policy statement. We have prepared a draft plan condition that the subdivider install appropriate boundary demarcations, which may include signage and property boundary monuments along the easterly and southerly property lines with that property at 1944 Bradley Avenue. With respect to the London plan, it is noted in our recommendations that Any modifications to MAP 1 place types or the MAP 3 street classifications in the London Plan will be undertaken and brought forward to Municipal Council as part of a future comprehensive review. The recommended draft plan and the proposed land use changes are generally consistent with the neighborhoods, green space, and the environmental review place types in the London Plan and the farmland place type. Neighborhood parks have been located and designed within the neighborhood to achieve a minimum of 50% of their perimeter bounded by a public street. And another aspect of the London Plan is the implementation of the walking and cycling routes that are identified in the active mobility network mapping. So this staff recommendation is approval of the proposed draft plan, the accompanying conditions of draft plan approval, the official plan and zoning bylaw amendments, approval of the proposed city-initiated official plan amendments on the 2 orphan parcels on Commissioners Road East, and no action on the third property located at the corner of Jackson Road and Bradley Avenue, as that part of the draft plan is being held for future development, and there are no proposed changes to the land use designation at this time. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mottram. Would the applicant like to speak? No, you're good? Okay, and move on to members of the public. If you'd like to make comment on this, please come to a microphone and state your name and address. Okay, and I'll ask another time, any members of the public that would like to make comment on this application? Okay, seeing none, we'll take a motion to close the public participation meeting. Okay, moved and seconded. We'll call the question.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 6-0.
Okay, committee looking for speakers. Councillor Helmer, then Hopkins.
Thank you, and thanks for the presentation, Mr. Mottram. Comprehensive, as always. You got me to get out the big sheet, so I finally learned that subdivisions require an actual piece of paper. So I'm looking at the street grid pattern, and first I want to say I'm really glad to see this come forward rather than some of the drafts that we've seen in the past. And frankly, even if you just look across the way at the subdivision that developed to the west of here, I just counted quickly on the map and it looked like there's 12 cul-de-sacs in that subdivision, and we don't have any over here. And I think that in terms of building those shorter trips, regardless of how you're traveling, creating those shorter trips, I think that's going to really help. Also from a snow clearing perspective, I can tell you a lot of the feedback I get about snow clearing is from people who live in cul-de-sacs. They don't really like that it's hard to plow cul-de-sacs, and I think in the long run, it really pays off for the residents who end up living in these areas. I wanted to comment on the length of the blocks. I think like it's a really good length of blocks. There's some that are pretty short, which I think is quite appropriate. Even the ones that are a bit longer, if you look at some of the other really great walkable parts of our city, they have block lengths that are longer than that, and I think it's going to work pretty well. I'm glad to see all the traffic circles. You know, this is something that I think when you think of long term and how the traffic flow is going to work in this neighborhood, this is going to be a great place to be driving. Even the long runs that are relatively straight streets where you can see a pretty long distance in one go, because they're not curvy as we've seen in some other subdivisions, you still got to weave in around those traffic circles a couple times, which is going to help keep the speeds down, which I think is going to make it great for people to live. So I think overall, very, very good. I want to start with that. There do seem to be a couple of opportunities though where I'm not quite sure why, other than perhaps to like fit in a couple of more lots, which I can understand the reasons for that, why the streets are aligned the way they are. So in the northeast corner of the site, so this is where Street B and Street E intersect. So they almost intersect also with Street D, but they don't. You know, like they're just slightly off. Street D is that window street that goes on to Commissioners in the northeast corner of the plan. And Street B is the east-west street that runs right there. And then you have Street E, which is the one that comes along the pathway system and the woodland. And so there are a couple of things about this particular area. One is it seems like Street D and Street E should be connecting. You know, that they shouldn't be misaligned like that. It's just a little bit off, and I'm not sure why we're doing that. And second, it seems like we could pull E further east to make that alignment happen. And then what you'd end up with is like, you'd have lots that are facing straight onto that natural woodland instead of lots that are backing onto that natural woodland. And I know that certainly people want, there's a lot of demand for rear lotted properties that back onto woodlands. People really like them. But I think having the view of the woodland without houses directly in front of you, when you're the forward facing lots, we've got policies, frankly, that encourage that. And so I wanted to ask about that around Street E, Street D, and Street B, because I think that might be advice we want to give the approval authority in terms of very small adjustments to the plan. That seems like a missed opportunity a little bit.
Mr. Mottram or Yeoman?
Yeah, thank you for the suggestion, Councillor Helmer. That is a good one, that the alignment there does not meet perfectly. Another way it could go, maybe as far as a proper alignment of the intersection is further to the west to be more central to the Street D where it connects east and west. That might be an opportunity, though, as you're suggesting, to consider the intersection at Street D. That was the plan that was set by the applicant when we reviewed it. We did provide for a little bit of a wider, regular shape, open space access. And we were also concerned about the establishment of a connection for the multi-purpose bicycle path that would utilize Street D, by the way, as well, and connect to Commissioners Road. So that has not been finalized. That would be something that we would be looking in more detail at the design study stage. I'm talking about the bicycle pathway connection to Commissioners Road.
So although I think it would be a nice bonus if the street grid connected, I think, my main concern is that I think it would be advantageous to frankly flip the blocks that, I'm just going to reference the block numbers. So block 1 and block 2, those are lots that are going to be they're rear facing onto the park, like this woodland area, right? And so the pathway is designed to go in behind them. And I think that if we shifted those over to be in with block 39 and block 38, you could have a couple more lots in those blocks and a couple fewer in the ones that are backing onto the woodland. The street would be further east. It would be potentially could connect into that Street D. I don't know if that actually would work with the grading and everything. I'm not sure. The pathway could run sort of adjacent to the roadway in that section. And then you'd have that, for at least for those lots that are sort of facing onto Street E and towards the woodland on 39 and 38, even if it's side, I'm not sure exactly how they're going to be oriented, but those would be some pretty spectacular views. And you would have that as a way into that part. There's also another spot, I think, in this plan where that could happen, but I think I'll just include that in the advice. I'll see if there's support for that in terms of for the approval authority to consider, because it seems like you probably wouldn't even have too many lots lost. You could probably just move them around a bit, and that might work. I mean, I'm not a subdivider, so I'll leave it to you guys to work out the details. But the second place where I see an opportunity for that is on Street L. And the reason I'm asking about this and sort of harping on it is because we have a policy that basically encourages this, right? To take, so natural heritage features, it's in the London plan, which I know isn't in full force and effect yet, but it's also referenced in the placemaking guidelines. It's policy 204, and it's talking about lotting patterns and getting the views onto those natural features. So block 8 is a low density block. Again, it's rear lotted onto that open space area, and so that's the one that abuts onto Street L. And again, it looks like if you just were to pull that Street L back, like so bring it north, you'd have longer blocks for 13, 12, 11, and 10, so you could put a few more lots in. You'd lose the rear lotted lots, but then you'd have front facing, like essentially a window street right onto the woodland, like that natural area, which I think would be great. I think it would look awesome. And I think they'd be in high demand. So I wonder if you could do that as well, pull the street L up a bit. So I don't know if my colleagues are interested in that. I think those are reasonable ideas. And I think it would be something the approval authority could consider anyway.
So, Councillor, if you like, the applicant indicated that they would like to answer some questions that you had, if you're open for that. Come on down, if you could just state your name and introduce yourself.
Hi, I might have to move this down a bit. I'm Stephanie, I'm from Stantec, and we also have Jeff from Development Engineering who can speak to some of the servicing issues. And the one large part that I'd like to say in terms of the comment regarding Street E, kind of the possibility of shifting that over. There are significant, and I can bring Jeff in here to speak to that, but there are significant grading concerns in that area, and so they require those rear lots in order to not install a third pipe system, right? So, and maybe you can speak to.
Yes, thank you, Stephanie. Part of the reason we have is we have to obviously match any grades up against the buffer or the wetland woodlot boundaries. All the units backing onto that area are pretty much walkouts for the most part. So soon as we shift the road over, we end up introducing retaining walls along the right of way to be able to maintain that grade while being able to shove the flows to the ultimate regional swim facility. The second part is the third pipe system or continuing flows to the wetland and the woodlot. We need to keep clean grassed areas contributing to this. So by using all the rear yards, that maintains base flows to those critical areas. If we do not have those rear yards and we flip everything around, then we have to put in a secondary pipe system throughout the subdivision, which ultimately is assumed infrastructure by the municipality. And the final point, obviously, that I think you alluded to is you end up with a single loaded road, which is never desirable from a development perspective. But the main crux had to do with the grading down around the treed woodlot, why we had to kind of shift it away to gain some of the grading separation to allow that to work.
Councillor?
Thank you. It's helpful to get some of the details around the grading. It doesn't sound like it's insurmountable. It sounds like, you know, if you were going to put a lot there, you'd need to be rear lotted, which makes sense. It seems like you could put a road there. If you had to do a retaining wall, you could do that. So not to say that, you know, it has to happen this way, but that potentially it's possible. That's all we're giving really is advice to the approval authority to try and work through those things. And I don't think it needs to be a big deal breaker. We didn't talk a little bit about the other street. I think it's L. I'm kind of losing track of all the street names, whether that's possible. And I don't necessarily need comments to that effect.
It's the same situation on both, sorry.
Yeah,
it works out to be the same
and
way.
I think it's probably going to be common, right? As you start transitioning into the natural areas, we've got policies in the plan to say we want to have views of the natural areas. I can see why in many circumstances it makes sense to have rear lotted lots backing onto those natural areas because it makes a lot of sense in terms of how that grading is going to work and everything. But if we did that every time, we'd never have the views of the natural areas. We'd have houses. And so I think we have to work that through. I think this subdivision is looking really good in terms of a new development. So I've talked a lot. I'm interested in know what my colleagues think about that as potential.
Mayor Brown, you're next on the speakers list.
Thanks, Chair. I didn't know if you'd had seen the representative from Stantec trying to catch your attention, so I was trying to give him an assist.
Good enough. Councillor Hopkins.
Yeah, thank you for the presentation. And I do have a question, and I guess I just want to go back to the history of this. I understand that this development was part of the placemaking demonstration project. And when I look at that, it's quite different to what it is today. And I just would like to understand, are we giving up on the placemaking? I know we've picked up some of the elements of that placemaking project in this plan, but it really has kind of changed a lot. And speaking to what Councillor Helmer said about the work around the woodlot, it seems like the woodlot is out of this project or not. I just wanted to get a sense of the history of the project, if someone could speak to that. What happened to it?
Mr. Mottram?
Through the chair, I'll take a stab at it. It predates me in this role, but I'm happy to comment on it. So the placemaking demonstration project was an excellent initiative by the city and the applicant as well at the beginning of the urban design program, if you recall, going back 10 years ago now. Mr. Mottram showed you the original concept plan that came in. We've talked about how we've avoided a lot of the loops and lollipops through the subdivision design as well. I think a lot of the principles that you saw in the placemaking demonstration project are here, though, when we look at a pedestrian-focused subdivision, opportunities for social interaction with the community spaces, the park spaces that you're looking at, the focal points of the neighborhood. Looking at high-quality public spaces as well and making sure that the subdivision's connected with the adjacent neighborhoods as well, a lot more than it was. And we're also looking at the trail system as well with the adjacent to the natural heritage features as well. So the placemaking demonstration project didn't bind the applicant to that outcome. You can see there's been many iterations since then, but we feel that this subdivision is far more consistent with the principles of that than the original submission.
Thank you for that clarification. And just to ask a further question, the density therefore is quite less than what the intent for this area was originally. Is that correct?
Through the chair, my understanding is the placemaking demonstration project did have a number of small lot singles associated with it. It was looking at things like rear garages and laneways as well. That perhaps hasn't been achieved through this plan. I will note, though, the staff report does speak to the zoning that's in place, which does call for a variety of single-family lot sizes, from 9-meter lots to larger lots as well, to provide a lot of diversity. Mr. Mottram spoke to the opportunity of street towns as well, which is something that's consistent with what the placemaking demonstration project was trying to achieve. In terms of density, when you look at higher order density, immediately to the north of this plan is a considerable amount of high density designated land. That's part of the high density overlay that's in the London plan. We want to make sure that that land is developed and achieved for that, recognizing the city structure plan is trying to redirect high density uses towards our key nodes and corridors in the future.
Anything further on this? Councillor Turner?
Thank you. Councillor Helmer raises some interesting points. I think actually it's good to have the applicant here. I think those were very helpful. It's hard to get the topography on, I guess there is a bit of topography in there, but it's difficult to see the kind of the contours and some of the small maps on the computer screen and the challenges associated with dealing with elevation changes. And I do have a general dislike of when we just kind of totally grade the site and kind of wipe out any of the elevations within it just to start fresh. So opportunities to use the existing elevations I think are helpful. So for that I might not support my colleague with the recommendations, but I think if there are opportunities for better alignment, those are always desirable. I also echo Councillor Helmer's comments about the rectilinear grid pattern. I remember looking at the application and it was just the stark contrast between the curvilinear just across Jackson and the rectilinear here. It's nice to see that starting to become more the norm and kind of the return to the grid. As I was reading through it, and I just wanted to confirm, because as I look, it states the conversion just in the preamble to the motion here, or the recommendations. Land use from urban reserve community growth and environmental review to low density residential multifamily density and open space to amend Schedule C. So I had difficulty in the blocks, but I think it's in the text in there that talks about those, the PSW and the significant woodland become OS5s. So right now, are they currently environmental review lands and then they're being changed into OS5s?
That's correct. They would be, the recommendation is to place those in the OS5 zone, yes.
Thank you, that's helpful. So nothing gets left as environmental review in any of this. Everything gets reapportioned and all the OP designations get updated.
Except for the future development lands south of Street Hen, those lands will be redesignated with the appropriate designation, including an open space designation and zoning that applies to the Scott Hampton Drain.
All right, thanks. And you had some comments there about not having a fence that traverses the PSW to do the designation. I think it was the concerns of the maple syrup farm owner and looking for fencing. I'd imagine the rear lotting prior to the multi-use pathway will be fenced, multi-use pathway, and then the OS5.
That's correct too, and that is in the conditions of draft plan approval for the 1.5 meter chain link fence with no gates.
Thank you. No, in general, I see a lot of very positive aspects to the application. I think it does recognize good land use provisions and planning. See the school block in there as well. It's helpful. So I can support the recommendation as it's put forward here.
Further speakers? Councillor Helmer?
Well, I'm going to give it a try, just drafted out some language and put it forward. And all I say to my colleagues is exploring the possibilities. I mean, it's going to happen or not. What it means is that it's going to be looked at to see if there's a possibility to do that. I think for Street E, I'm just looking at the topography. I hear what the fellow was saying, but it doesn't look like it's totally unmanageable to bring the street a bit further east. And then you'd have that sort of front facing and the views onto there. And similarly, down in the south end, to bring L forward, I mean, you can kind of see the maps on the line. It doesn't look, again, like it's going to be a huge problem. So I think it's worth looking at. If it's not possible, it's not going to be possible. We've got staff who can look into the details. I know the applicant's got their technical people. I think it's worth exploring. I've drafted language to that effect that is where we will support exploring the movement of those things and not that we insist on it happening.
Okay, Councillor, your wording is under B. I'd like to review that. Okay, is anyone prepared to move that? Oh, Mr. Yeoman?
Through you, Madam Chair, just a technical clarification. Development Services is, of course, quite happy to approach the applicant and discuss these matters with them. What I would suggest, though, is that the official plan recommendations that you have before you and the zoning bylaw recommendations as well, you refer to a future meeting to allow these discussions to happen. I think that if discussions were to change the subdivision design, which would be as a result of this, that we'd then have to come back and amend the official plan designations and zoning to reflect that. So if you referred that to a future meeting, I think you could allow those conversations to occur.
That's helpful. I could imagine the block to the east of the road, if it's not going to be a residential block. I understand what you're saying. It could be something open space. Makes sense. How much time do you think you would need to talk about that and come back? Because I imagine there's a delay. This is a big project. I'm sure people want to be moving forward. I just wonder how much time we're talking about.
Through the chair, I think probably we could get back beginning of November, late November for PEC. We definitely accelerate these conversations with the applicants, recognizing that we're here today and wanting to keep this moving forward.
Okay, Councillor, the advice I'm getting from the clerk is that to go forward with this course, that it would be best to refer the whole thing back at this time. Is that what you'd be prepared to move then?
Yeah, I'll try that. I think we're talking about basically an entire month and then a bit more to get back to planning, which is obviously a long time, but it's basically 1,000 units of housing, and I think spending a bit of time on it and making sure it goes right. It's been in the works for years. I think it's worth exploring, and I would move the referral.
Is there a seconder for the referral? Councillor Hopkins?
Yeah, I'll second the referral. I understand this development is being on the books for a number of years. November doesn't seem to be too long a wait to have it come back, and I think it's worth going through the discussions to see if we can better align the roads and the streets to take advantage of the natural heritage. So,
okay, second. Councillor Brown. Mayor Brown, pardon me.
I thought you were going to say captain, so okay. Chair, I did notice that the representative from Stantec was trying to catch our attention, and I would like to, with your permission, because we're at committee, just get his feedback on what a delay like this might mean.
I appreciate that. Thank you, Mayor. All due respect, folks, with a little bit of information and insight here, we've already gone through this process, Councillor Helmer, and I probably should have noticed that further, and I know Paul wouldn't have had the opportunity to know that, but staff had at one point came with that recommendation to have the lots or the roadway fronting onto the wetland and the woodlot buffer. And we had an economic plan, a logistics plan, where we were going to have several major retaining walls of upwards of 8 feet along that embankment that the city would own and be maintaining, not to mention we'd have road salt issues within the wetland and the buffer. So we've already, in all due respect, we've already had this interaction with staff. So that's why I'm a little apprehensive to go back and do it again, because I'm pretty confident we're going to come back with the exact same result that we have right now. So I just kind of want to reiterate that, and I don't know if Larry is aware of that discussion or not. I know there's been some staffing changes in the role between Jenny, Dan, and Paul, or Jenny Ramsey, sorry. So I would hope that staff would be able to concur that we've already had those discussions to hopefully come up with the plan that you see before us, to keep it on schedule where it is.
Okay, looking for a staff response if there's anybody here who has the information.
My apologies through you, Madam Chair. I don't have anything to add to that at this time. So.
Mayor?
Thank you. Just to follow up, and I just want to get a sense that it's because you weren't part of those discussions, you don't know if those discussions occurred?
Through you, Madam Chair, Your Worship, that's correct. I trust Mr. Thomas's opinion, though, on these matters.
So, at this point, Chair, I wouldn't be in a position to support this motion because I don't think we have all the information that's required to make a decision that's based on the best possible information we can get from staff. I will be voting against this at committee. I would look for more information at council, and I'm sure that Ms. Ramsey can convey what kinds of discussions occurred and what options had been considered. If this option hadn't been considered, then I think it might be worth taking a look at that time. But based on the information that I have, I can't support the motion before us.
Any other speakers? Councillor Turner?
Thank you. I'd agree with the mayor at this point. I think for us to wade into to alignments steps a little far into our realm and purview and a little bit out of our expertise. I do completely recognize what Councillor Helmer is seeking to accomplish here, and I think it's a great consideration. It sounds to me that a lot of the alignment, and even when I look at the alignment on the proposal, that it looks like in all the iterations that it's come a long way, that a lot of morphing has happened. And this is one that I think is appropriate to move forward. These parcels have been sitting for a long time, and now have gone through the process to come to a proposal for us, and I think it's worthy for us to consider. I think it's worthy for us to approve as well.
Okay, just one moment. The clerks are working on something. Okay, so we can open the referral for call the question on that once it's moved and seconded, of course. Okay, we can call the question.
Closing the vote, the motion fails 2-4.
Okay, and we can put the staff recommendation on the floor and looking for a mover and seconder. Councillor?
I'm just waiting for it to come up. I'm sure there we go. So now I'm going to vote against the whole thing because we're not willing to take a look at it and have a little bit of delay, and I think that's really unfortunate. Overall, almost everything in here is really good. And now that's the position I'm in, so that's unfortunate. I do think that if I could approve just parts of it, I would, to say, you know, but I'm not gonna put us through all these pieces where some parts of the blocks I would support and other parts I'm not going to, but.
Okay, any further speakers? Seeing none, we can call the question. And just before we call the question on that, we'll get some more information prior to the council meeting with regarding how the conversations had gone in the past. Councillor?
I hate to do this, I'd like it to just go through because I wanted it to happen, but there is a language in there that says the approval authority be advised that we exploring the extension, which is what I suggested in the first place. And so I imagine people don't actually want to move that.
Thank you for catching that. So the original staff recommendation is up. It's been moved and seconded. We'll call the question.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 4-2.
Okay, thank you, colleagues. On to agenda item number 13, a request from Municipality of Middlesex Centre, the ARPA Sanitary Servicing, and Delaware Water Servicing. And which member of staff will be speaking to this? Mr. Barrett.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just a very quick overview, just to sort of let you know what's in front of you. This matter has been in front of Planning Committee at least twice before. And it's based on a request from Middlesex Centre for the city to look at amending our current servicing agreement for sanitary servicing. Just a bit of background. We've been providing sanitary services. The City of London has been providing sanitary service to Arvor since 2000. The original agreement was signed on the 3rd of April of 2000. In the existing agreement, I just pulled out a couple of bullets. It sets a treatment rate, in other words, a payment rate of 0.079 cents per liter, equivalent to the city's, which was equivalent to the city's 2000 rate, to be adjusted from time to time. Also in the current agreement that the city accepts up to 175 cubic meters of sewage per day based on a 2-month rolling average. So the city monitors volumetrically the amount of sewage that's coming down the pipe from Richmond Street and monitors that volume. The agreement was amended actually just 4 months later on the 21st of June 2000. And in that amending agreement, 2 things were done. It established a cap of 10 new residential units per year, rather than just the flow cap of 175 cubic meters per day. And it also provided for up to 1,000 square meters of commercial per year, not to exceed 4,500 square meters in a 10-year period. Just a year and a bit later, the agreement was amended again. And in that time, it set a staged cap of equivalency of 10 new residential units per year, not to exceed 50 units per 5-year period. So it added that not to exceed 50 units per 5-year period to the 2000 amendment. And it also established equivalencies for different unit types. And the baseline was set at single and semi-detached units, 3+ bedrooms. That equaled 1 unit. And then from there down, there was a declining equivalency based on number of bedrooms or unit type. But there were no changes to the commercial caps. So that's part of the background. When we last reported on this back in 2013, at that point, we'd gone back and looked at some of the data, and there was what we estimated 131 unit equivalents remaining. That was based on the total number of units that were provided for in the original agreement, what had occurred and transpired, and translating that. So that turned into about 131 unit equivalents based on, as I said, 2011. There's not been much development, if any, since that time. The reason for the ask was that there's a proposed development known as the Weldon subdivision. The draft plan of subdivision had 122 single detached lots, 62 townhouse lots. That's a total of 184 units, but again, based on this unit equivalency, it turns into 170 unit equivalents. And so based on our estimate, the current agreement is about 39 units short of the full build-out of ARVA. Now, this, I think, is very important. This is the schedule that's attached to the current agreement. There's an area here, and I'm just going to go now to what actually is now approved within the ARVA settlement area. The city actually intended, through this agreement, to provide for servicing for all of the lands within this boundary. But it established some caps on those lands. But the intent was always to provide for the servicing of the identified settlement area of ARVA. Through an official plan amendment, the ARVA settlement area has actually been reduced. So there's not as much potential development within their urban settlement area, but there's still our capacity cap, or still the city's capacity cap that exists. So this is not something that has, this providing services has not opened up a lot of additional development within ARVA. As a matter of fact, since the agreement was originally done, the settlement area boundary has decreased. In the report, we identified some pros and cons in supporting a change in the amendment, and I've just highlighted some of these here. There is provincial policy statement language around the provision of services and within adjacent municipalities of providing for those opportunities for efficient provision of service. This is a cost-effective means of servicing growth within the settlement area. From an environmental perspective, not from an environmental perspective, it's a good thing because there would be no new plant discharging into the Medway. And this does provide for some limited control over the growth in ARVA under the current agreement. Some of the cons in amending the agreement, and these certainly have been raised by both the previous council and by members of the development community in the past. And the big one is that this would facilitate growth outside the city's urban growth area. And it would facilitate essentially what would be suburban development immediately on the boundary of the city. The primary issue related to providing for these services outside the city's growth boundary is that within the urban growth boundary, the city, through its GMIS program, looks at and matches our ability to pay and provide for growth with lands that we need to service. And within the north end of the city, immediately across this boundary, there are areas that cannot yet develop because they've not yet had municipal services provided. They're not yet on stream to come on. So that's been a big concern. There's also the potential loss of DC revenues to the city. We do not recoup those revenues. We recoup a portion of those under the current agreement. There is residual capacity on the current agreement, so we've already agreed to provide for more. And so there is that capacity that's there. The initial rationale for servicing was to address environmental issues because there were servicing and environmental constraints with failing septic systems. This no longer exists because the servicing is now provided. So in the report, we laid out three possible options. Option one, no change to the current agreement. Leave with the current caps, which are the, as I said, 10 units per year, no more than 50 per 5 years. It's got a flow cap there. There's already a commercial component that's been provided. Option two would be to remove the annual cap, but not increase the total number of units permitted. In other words, do not provide for what we estimate to be 39 unit deficiency that would allow for the build out of the Weldon subdivision as currently proposed, but would remove the annual cap of 10 units per year, but keep the 50 units per 5 years. So in other words, if this subdivision were to come on, and in its initial stages, they were looking at permitting 25, 30 lots in the first year and 15 lots in the second year. That would be permitted so long as we did not exceed the 50 per 5 years.
And option 3 would be to amend the agreement to remove all the caps, remove both the annual cap and provide for the full servicing of the number of lots identified in the current plan of subdivision. So those are the 3 options that we put in front of you. If the city was to consider amending the agreement, we believe there are some other considerations that we would want to make sure were addressed. To certainly ensure and clarify that Middlesex Centre would be responsible for all the capital costs associated with this change in the agreement. Amend the agreement to explicitly allow for the carryover of unused capacity to future years. What this means is that I don't believe that it was the intent that it would be a use it or lose it provision within the agreement. Now, while it doesn't say explicitly you can't do this, nor does it say explicitly you can do this, whereby if there was unused capacity within the 5-year period of the 50 units within that 5-year period, that you would not be able to use that in the next 5-year period. So if Middlesex Centre had only developed 40 units in the first 5 years, and then the next 5 years not to just be capped at the 50, but allow the 10 that weren't used up in the previous 5. So explicitly provide for that carryover. Amend the agreement to require payment equivalent to the current water and wastewater servicing charges, composed of the development charge, but and also require the city treatment rate to be equivalent to the current treatment rate, but also not just this from time to time change, but build in that there would be the automatic change. If our rates change, the rate that would be collected would change. So those would be some considerations. What we're asking you today is just consideration of the options, and if council wishes to pursue an amendment to the agreement, then identify these considerations and any other the committee might have. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Barrett. Looking for speakers? Mayor Brown?
Thank you very much, Chair. I don't know how the committee will go with this, but I see no reason to change. And I know that I lived through this request coming to last council, and Joni Beckler at the time led the charge, and I was very supportive of not making any change to this agreement. The agreement was established originally, as you heard today, for environmental concerns. There was leakage, and effluent was making its way into to Medway Creek. That's no longer a problem. I look at the challenges that we face as a community, trying to grow inward and upward ourselves. I look at the commitment to 45% of our growth will be brownfield development, infill development, and I see this as counter to that. I think that this is the true definition of urban sprawl when we see veteran communities just on the outskirts of London developing properties, and then those communities have full access to all of the services of this community, creating all kinds of issues, including all the ones that we're trying to prevent ourselves with our London plan. So certainly, and I say this respectfully to our neighbors to the north, this is not something that I supported several years ago. It's not something I'm going to support this evening, and I should hope that that the committee moves in this direction as well, based on the many conversations that we've had in the past. But I think we'll see through the debate.
Thank you. Further speakers? Councillor Turner?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have a few questions. This one was interesting reading it. I remember the discussion in 2013. Perhaps not the nuance of it, but certainly the discussion. If our servicing wasn't extended to ARVA, if it wasn't there, we'd have those environmental impacts that the mayor talked about. But where would their growth policies land? Would the Middlesex Centre have the ability to say they could grow without restriction? Right now, it seems that the restriction on their growth is based purely on their agreement with us on that pipe. So without those restrictions from the neighbor agreement that we have here, how would Middlesex Centre determine its land use policy with respect to ARVA settlement area?
Through the chair, I'll take the first cut, and if I miss something, I'm sure somebody else will provide some cover up. Their policies are in most instances, for example, within their designated growth areas, they do provide or do require that there be municipal servicing available for that. So Kamoka Kilworth, Delaware is on, has water but does not have full on-site septic or sanitary. ARVA does rely on the agreement, but as I indicated, the amount of, the area to be serviced was determined in the 2000 agreement. That boundary has not been amended, notwithstanding the fact that Middlesex Center has actually decreased the settlement area boundary of ARVA. With respect to changing it, just like the City of London, they could go through a review and look at what their population, employment, household forecasts are and could amend their boundaries for the settlement areas accordingly, which is what they did when they went through the last 5-year review that they undertook, and they actually decreased hamlet areas, not only in ARVA, but some of the other settlement areas that I identified, and focused that growth in 3 settlement areas, or 2 settlement areas, Delaware and, Kamoka, Kilworth, Ilderton, and to a small degree, Delaware. So like us, they go and review those same inputs that will go in looking at future demand and make those adjustments accordingly.
Gotcha, okay. So ultimately, in ARVA would be, I guess, a rural settlement similar to the ones that we have within the City of London larger boundary outside of the urban growth boundary that are allowed to exist, but have fairly strict limits. We don't extend servicing to them. And the same thing would happen in ARVA without this. And our attempt here was to mitigate the environmental impacts of the upstream flow into Medway Creek down into London. So ultimately, this seems to be somewhat precipitated by that development application that comes forward that has the extra 30 some odd units of above what their threshold of allotment are. Had somebody not come forward with a development proposal for 131 within the permitted amount of development, they came in and asked for excess of that. Is that correct? Of kind of what the catalyst to bring this in front of us is?
Well, Madam Chair, there's 2 issues here, and one is the current agreement indicates that you can only have 10 units constructed per year. So there's an overall capacity issue or perspective, and as the councillors pointed out, the overall capacity within the agreement is less than what that subdivision application would require. But the second is the timing of development. So when you're developing a subdivision, 10 units at a time is not something that works very well. So what we're suggesting to you is you have a couple of options here. One is to say, no, just leave it as it is. The idea was to resolve the environmental issue, which has now been resolved, but in terms of development, to allow some small-scale development to occur over time, but not to allow a subdivision. That's something that's to occur in the City of London. That's one perspective. Another perspective is let's allow for development at a slightly greater rate, and that would be rather than just 10 per year, and if you don't build your 10, that 10's gone, you can essentially accumulate. So you could do 50 over 5 years. So you could wait 5 years and develop 50 of those units. So that's a second option. And the third option is to say, build it at your pace as the market demands it. And as Mr. Barrett has pointed out, each of these options have some pros and cons. Certainly one of the items that we're looking at is the growth management implementation strategy, how we're allocating servicing within our urban growth boundary. There's even developers that are inside our municipal boundary that would love to have access to our services, and we're being very judicious. I think your council's being very judicious as to how it allocates services. So there are some options. We've put what we would call not a recommended, but something that we think is worthy of consideration by council, which would just be going to the 50 units per 5-year period, not going beyond that and not changing the overall allocation is what we're suggesting. It's something worthy of consideration, but certainly the other options are up for council to consider.
Okay, thank you. So a lot of really odd little provisions within this whole agreement. The fact that we're selling water at the large, like the bulk purchasing price rather than on the residential rate. So ultimately there ends up being this this margin that Middlesex Centre gets to take off the water that we're providing them too, instead of this just kind of being a cost neutral exercise. The development charge piece was interesting too in the discussion there. I mean, ultimately, I was a little perplexed by the statement of potential loss of development charges. Ultimately, the DCs themselves are really supposed to pay for the works that are associated with that development, rather than being a kind of a revenue generator, well, kind of a profit generator, right? By stating it as a loss of development charges seems to state that we're not getting development charges into the community in London that we could use for our works when the DCs themselves would be for works associated with ARVA. So, perhaps, Mr. Yeoman, you could explain that through you, Madam Chair.
Through you, Madam Chair, just to provide a bit of clarification. So when we do our development charges master plans, we're looking at forecasted growth within the city. From there, things like wastewater treatment capacity in particular is very much impacted by the quantity, the total quantity of development that we'd have and the corresponding population associated with that. Through this agreement, if we're then reserving some of that capacity we're planning on for lands outside of the urban growth boundary, we're actually not properly planning for that capacity, and therefore that's when you get into the DC piece of a contribution that's not being received for the capital costs associated with that growth.
Thank you, Mr. Yeoman. That makes a lot of sense there. I mean, ultimately, it's the way the agreement was done, both on the commercial rate for water and the capital cost associated with the pipe extensions and everything else that comes with that, not being realized. Right? So, so we've fixed a problem, created a couple economic ones. I'm intrigued on, I mean, as the mayor suggests, kind of the do nothing, let's maintain things as they are. That's helpful, but it doesn't address some of these economic considerations. I'm concerned, on the other hand, if we try to address these economic considerations, then we create this development pressure that exists on our borders in terms of our compact urban growth forum. The other really weird philosophical piece in all of this is that we're now, our arrangement with our neighbor has a direct impact on their growth policies, and they're kind of beholden to that just out of an arrangement that we have with them. So we had an earlier discussion about industrial lands early in the term, and decided, well, we'll allow our neighbors to chart their own course on these things. We may or may not recommend it, but for us to impose the municipality's will upon a neighboring municipality is challenging. Kind of philosophically challenging. In this circumstance, I think, especially with ARVA being right on our doorstep, there's some merit to having some constraints, whether they're imposed constraints as a result of the servicing agreement. And I can see why no action ends up not being taken, because there's so many considerations to try and find our way through it. The last piece in here is the that 5-year. Does that end up being a rolling average, or is it like a 2015 to 2020, 2020 to 2025? How does that look?
Through the chair, that would certainly be up to you as council. Truly, sorry, I didn't mean that to be flip, but if we're establishing a new agreement, which we would be if we're going to be opening it up, and we could address these financial considerations as part of that, then through that agreement could specify that it's 5 years starting 2016, 2017, so for the period 2017 to 2022 it would be this, and march it out that way. That certainly is something that the council can provide direction.
And just to give a little bit of scope to this and edges, is that we're looking for some direction is what we've asked for here. It doesn't have to be specific. We will then take the direction conceptually, take it back, and work on a an agreement if that is the direction that we can then bring back for approval. And if there are some changes that you want to make to the specifics of what we bring back, there'll be an opportunity to do so. To your question again, you could go retroactive to say, 10 per year that hasn't been used up, that can all be brought forward, or you could say it's from here forward, 50 over 5 years. There's many different ways, but I think that the options that we've laid out are trying to give you a sense of, do you want to just leave it alone and keep it as a very minor bit of development that's allowed through the servicing agreement? Do you want to do something which is about halfway there, not quite what the municipality, the developer associated with the application would be looking for, or do you want to go all the way? And if we can get some sense of that from you, then we'll put something together, work with them, and come back to you.
Thank you, and sorry to monopolize the mic. It's this one certainly had my attention. So ultimately, it sounds that if we were to try and make some of the corrections to some of those items, specifically on DCs and rates and the like, to be able to find a way that it ends up being relatively cost neutral to us, recovers the fees associated, and pays for the servicing in an appropriate way. In order to do that, we'd have to have a bit of a trade-off. We'd have to be able to go to Middlesex Centre and say, we'd like to renegotiate this agreement. In exchange for that, we can talk about that cap and how that's applied. Is that, and it seemed to nod, so okay. Last final question, and I promise I'll get off this thing, is why 10? Why was it 10 units per year? Is that based on a growth forecast, or was it an arbitrary number?
Through the chair, I don't know. I was here in 2000, but I had nothing to do with the agreement. But I do know that from one of the previous reports that we looked at through the early 2000s when there was development occurring, they averaged about 7 per year. So the 10 might have been something to give them a little bit more. I don't know. I don't know there was magic behind it.
And I would say in order of magnitude, it represents an amount that probably is not going to have an impact on the City of London's home building industry. 10 units per year, I don't think people would argue that that's going to have a major impact on something that's developing in the north end of our city. Getting up to some of the larger numbers might be something that people would argue is a concern, and I think that just that order of magnitude is a consideration.
I lied.
Turner?
The one last one. So do we have a sense of what that net subsidy ends up being by foregone DCs and water rate and things like that?
Through the chair, I don't have that information. I don't know if Mr. Mathers does, but he might be able to clarify.
I've got a few other speakers on list, so maybe unless you have it off the cuff, we can come back to it. I got Councillor Cassidy, then Hopkins.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I would be in favor of option 1, which is the do nothing option. And I just want to, I don't have any questions. I just want to go through the report a little bit. First of all, under the analysis section, it says that there are no significant changes to the pros and cons. Well, I think there have been some changes in London, just in general. In London, first of all, we passed the London plan. And I think the community in general has the community, not our staff, but the community has a better appreciation of planning principles around urban sprawl and all of that. This council's passed the 45%, as Councillor Turner mentioned, the target rate for infill and intensification of 45%. And also we're having active ongoing discussions about BRT and multimodal transportation, not just BRT, but the need for us as a society and a community to get away from car-oriented developments. As part of the pros as well, it talks about inter-regional cooperation and coordination, and you've provided that in your background through you, Madam Chair. Staff's provided that in context, all of the things that we do with our regional partners to cooperate, and I would include Middlesex London Health Unit, London Middlesex Housing Corporation, our Housing Development Corporation. These are all things that we do with the county and not just the City of London. So I had a note here as well to talk about that industrial land issue that Councillor Turner brought up. And the reason well, as a council, I believe that we supported that, not going to the OMB, that was the whole thing, was we decided not to appeal their decision to open up more industrial land. And we decided not to appeal that because it really didn't have a large impact on London, and we wanted to be good neighbors. So I think this is kind of the opposite issue. I think there's potential for impact on London, and I think we have proven many times that we are good neighbors with our regional partners. So one of the risks, I think, in increasing the cap, so if we're going to do, any bits of these options that have been presented to us, one of the risks is having a larger development going in all at once rather than 10 units per year, is the risk of storm surge overflows into the river at the end of the day, right? That's what happens when we have a large storm and there's overflows and everything like that. So I think increased development increases that risk to the city. But I want to talk about something else that Mr. Barrett said. He said this has been this agreement's been in place for a number of years, and we haven't seen that it's opened up development, and there hasn't been a big, large amount of development that's gone on in ARVA because of this agreement. But I think that the situation has changed recently, especially just in the last year or two in London with regard to housing. We have a really low vacancy rate here in London. We're seeing surging housing prices here in London. We're seeing buyers coming from Toronto where they're, in speculative buying and investor buying, non-resident buying is being discouraged through the tax that they were allowed to the non-resident tax that they're now allowed to apply. So I think by doing this, we run the risk of seeing a lot of development taking place there in ARVA, given the environment that's going on around us. As the mayor said, this is just urban sprawl. Even though it's not our own urban sprawl, I think we would be seen as encouraging urban sprawl and encouraging this kind of development taking place on the outskirts of London. I know in Ward 5, I still have a pocket in Ward 5 that's on septic. And this is they are living right next door to ARVA. So we would be extending these services to non-London residents when my residents in Ward 5 are asking me repeatedly, when are we going to get this servicing in our neighborhood? So at the end of the day, I think for me is who do we as a council answer to? We answer to the residents of London and the homeowners, and not just homeowners, but renters and property tax payers of London, whether they're paying through their own property tax or whether they're paying through their rent. And one of the main ways we have of keeping the tax levy low for residents of London is through assessment growth. So if we're encouraging or seen to encourage development outside of London, and make no bones about it, they're living so close to the city limits of London, the majority of these people living in this area would probably come to London for work, for recreation, and avail themselves of all the London services that are paid for through property taxes, and yet they're not paying property taxes in London. And again, if you have one family with a foot in ARVA and a foot in London trying to decide where they're going to buy their first home or any home, if property taxes are lower in ARVA because it's a rural settlement, because they don't have to provide the same level of services that we as a city do, it might make it easier for someone to choose not to live in London, not to pay property taxes in London. We have hospitals, roads, sewers, infrastructure, fire, police, all of these levels of servicing that we have to provide as a city that they do not have to provide there. And yet the residents can still come here and enjoy those services that London residents do. So those are all the reasons why I will support the no change option. And at the very least, if the committee goes the other way, I would hope that the additional considerations would all be added in, with the exception of allowing a carryover. I'm not in favor of allowing the carryover, but my first choice is option 1.
Okay, thank you, Councillor. I've got Councillor Hopkins, then Helmer.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I do have a question for you to staff. I just want to be clear that if we do pick option 1, that means that we do not change anything. We allow the 10 lots not to exceed 50 in 5 years, and we continue doing that every 5 years. Is that correct? So when will this agreement come up for renewal, I guess, is my question.
Through the chair, the agreement doesn't come up for renewal. This is the agreement. The agreement provides for, so the only caps on the agreement right now are the flow rates and the 10 units per year, not to exceed 50 in 5, and then the caps on the commercial development.
So it's coming up for renewal. And if we took an option not to renew it at all, what
Councillor,
happens?
if I could be helpful, that's not up for renewal. We could choose to open it and amend it if we wanted to and renegotiate at this point.
So if we're going to renegotiate and not to do anything, not to allow the 10 units, what happens?
Through the chair, I don't know, I guess what could happen would we could attempt to change some of the financial considerations without changing any of the other pieces.
Mr. Fleming?
And Madam Chair, I think that the complete answer would be something provided by legal, but I think like any agreement that's established, you need both parties to come to the table in order to renegotiate it. And so I think though that the details of that question should be answered by our legal office.
Thank you for that. I think I'm fine understanding the details there. So for me here, it really is just a matter of picking the option 1, which is, I guess, just to have no change. And the reason, to me, it's pretty basic. I know we started out in 2000 to help ARTHA because of the problems that they were having with the sewage entering Medway Creek. And that was 16 years ago, 17 years ago. That's been a long time. I just do not see increasing it at all, given the fact that their whole own development has decreased. So it just doesn't make any sense. Why would we increase it and give them more if they are experiencing less of the development? But for me, it's all about, I think it's really, it undermines our development. I have a ward that would like probably some servicing and sewers. And I know they're coming, but it does undermine our development, and it also undermines the taxpayer and the money that they contribute to development. So if anything, I would be just picking option 1 and just staying with what we've been doing all along.
Councillor Helmer?
Thank you. I've got a question through the chair to our staff. I know Mr. Barrett briefly just went through and said, they've actually contracted the settlement area in ARVA. And I just wonder, I'm just not that familiar with ARVA and their plans as I am with London's, but can you give me a sense of what in the settlement area isn't already built out and what the maximum potential build out is? Like they've contracted essentially their rural growth boundary. And I just wonder what it actually meant in real terms.
Through the chair, it's essentially this area here is what was taken out, which is, if you know ARVA, it's the area north of the mill pond. It would have been problematic and difficult to service anyway, because you would have had to come down and then come back up the hill. So there were some servicing constraints on that. The developable area is this area right here. And that's the area that could accommodate through the draft plan of subdivisions. I said the 184 units, 170 unit equivalency within that area. So that their settlement area boundaries and their servicing area boundaries are the same, save and except this block of land here to the north. So our current agreement allows the servicing of this, notwithstanding that it's not within the servicing area.
You might want to just stay at the mic, Mr. Barrett. So thank you for the map. It's helpful to have it up. So the light yellow is residential.
Yes, the light yellow is residential. This is a commercial area here. And then this is a medium density area in right here. Everything else is a low density residential, and then the Weldon Park.
Thank you. And it looks like, so there's this area to the west where you were talking about, this is the subdivision we're talking about tonight. And then to the east, there's another block there that looks like it's not developed yet, east of Arva Street. And then after that, it's all already built out. Is that right?
No, through the chair, actually, that's Medway High School. So that's already built and developed. It's within their low density area.
Thank you. So, colleagues, I have a lot of things to say about this particular one. I'm going to try and keep it as short as I possibly can. I'm going to start with the fact that we just approved a 1,000-unit subdivision on farmland in the southeast corner of our city, right up against the urban growth boundary. And I mean, I didn't vote for it, but 4 other people did. And, you know, I think we have to be very careful about getting too involved in the affairs of our neighboring municipalities. This is a municipality that has just contracted its growth boundary. They made it smaller. We haven't done that. We made ours bigger, effectively, by rolling out some industrial land and then pulling in and redesignating industrial land into residential. And that's what we did. I didn't support that either. But we did that. And I think that we have to be very, very careful about talking about how we're against urban sprawl and then actually allowing new subdivisions in our city, but then effectively prohibiting them or trying to cut them down a bit in neighboring municipalities. The municipality of Middlesex Centre is 588 square kilometers. It's a big municipality. It's bigger than London by area. And they have done a pretty good job of preserving their prime agricultural land as agricultural land. We, on the other hand, have not. We've built all kinds of housing all over agricultural land in the boundaries of the City of London. And I think it's important to recognize that, you know? So if the reason that we're against making changes to this agreement is that we want to prevent urban sprawl, I mean, we might want to try being more like Arva and Middlesex Centre and less like what we've done in the past. I think we've got a good plan with the London plan. I do think it puts us in a really tough position when we're trying to hold the line on our urban growth boundary and we don't want to expand it. And there's lots of people who would like us to expand it, to bring in lands that are very easily serviceable, very closely connected, very cheap to add into our existing servicing that are just outside the urban growth boundary. There are other lands that are expensive to service that are inside the growth boundary. And I understand why people are very frustrated about that. And I could see how they would have a really hard time with something being facilitated even outside of the city boundaries through servicing that they don't have access to. And that's why, for me, like, it's a difficult issue. It's not totally straightforward what we should be doing. I think there's very important big picture principles at play. You know, to what extent do we let our neighboring municipalities make their own decisions about what it is that they want to do? How important is it to us that, you know, this is probably the most efficient from a cost perspective, regardless of who's paying. This is probably the most efficient way of handling that. I was glad to see, for example, that Middlesex Centre, when they did their EA for Delaware, and the water supply and storage side of things, not the wastewater side, but the water supply and storage side, that they decided to disconnect to the regional water supply system. I think that's a very good decision. I think the regional water supply system itself, on both sides, connected to both rivers, is a really good example of great intermunicipal cooperation. You know, that is a very smart thing for which we depend on our neighboring municipalities to make that work for the City of London. So it's a tough one for me. I don't really like to see any farmland redeveloped into housing. I know that the folks who live in Arva don't like to see that either. I know that people who are on Middlesex County Council want to preserve their prime agricultural lands. And I frankly have a lot of faith in them that they'll do that. They have a very small settlement area. that they've just made smaller, they're going to build it out eventually sometime. You know, it's not a question of whether this is gonna get built out, it's how fast is it gonna get built out. This is the one subdivision that they kind of have left. Potentially, I guess, way in the future, they might make it a little bit bigger. It seems pretty unlikely to me. So I think some of the agreements that we've made and provisions in this agreement are a bit odd. So we have this 10 per year cap. Why is that relevant? Why do we want it to be 10 per year? You know, that seems to me, frankly, to be an anti-competitive type of measure that makes it more attractive to develop in London and less attractive to develop in Arva. And I don't know why we should be involved in that at all. I could see having some sort of scale-related pieces to say, you know, we don't want you to build 2,000 units, you know, connect them and expand your growth boundary, and then all of a sudden it's all coming down through. So I think that is controlled through the flow provisions, right? We can say this is the flow. Because frankly, if people keep getting better and better at conservation and they start developing things that are using less and less water that's being discharged back into the systems, they can hit 180, maybe 10 or 15 years down the road, they'll be able to build out all those units because the equivalent number of units, it won't be actually providing the flows that they're allowed. So, you know, if our concern is really on the flow side, that's one thing. If our concern is that we're just trying to prevent more houses being built in Middlesex Center, I'm not really convinced by that argument. In terms of where people want to live, I think it's important to recognize too that, you know, I don't really think Arva is competing so much with London. I guess really on the boundaries maybe. But Arva is competing with other places in Middlesex Center for people to live, places in Thames Center. That's the kind of lifestyle people want. They want to live in a rural place. I've lived in rural places. It's not like London for the most part. We do have some rural places in London, but you know, I don't know that that's such a big problem. I'd rather have contiguous development in rural settlement areas than I would like to see, you know, the edges of our city being built out right up to the urban growth boundary. So this is a very tough one for me. I think leaving it alone is not causing a huge problem, and receiving the report and leaving it as it doesn't prevent us from doing something in the future. Certainly this could be built out in phases anyway, and if they build it out and they didn't leave part of it, we could deal with it down the road. But I'm not persuaded by the arguments I've heard tonight about, you know, why we should leave it alone. And I'm surprised, frankly, that no one from Middlesex Center is here to talk about it. It seems like it's an important thing for them, and I haven't heard from the mayor or any of their council about it. But I think that it's something we need to be careful about, how we approach it, how we talk about it. And I think we need to sort of put regional cooperation at the forefront and not, you know, seem as like the condescending big brother, which sometimes I think that's how it can come across when the city is talking about county business.
Everyone's looking at me because I haven't spoken yet. I can make comments from the chair. I can move either. Recognizing both sides of this issue here, I think the one that kind of puts me firmly in the camp of option 2 is the treatment and flow rate, because this is it's a hemorrhage point for our budget every year, right? And I think that there's no harm in going to the table and saying, let's open up this agreement and look at this. And to be frank, the 10 unit cap or 50 over 5 years, there's 6 of one or half a dozen of the other for me. So I can't move it from the chair, but I'd be supportive of option 2 going forward. And if that fails, going back to the do nothing, because I don't think that blowing the cap wide off behooves anybody, but I do think that it's worth having the conversation going forward. And for me, it's the treatment and the treatment rate that's a problem.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just to provide a little context, I'm doing a little digging around in Middlesex Center's official plan. So it designates Arva as a community settlement area. It talks about that, as Mr. Barrett talked about, the focus of their development being more Kamulka-Kilworth and Ilderton than here. And it says the concentration and intensity of development is expected to be lower than in urban settlement areas. While such areas are expected to accommodate a portion of municipalities' growth, this is expected to be less than growth in the urban settlement areas. And so it really kind of downplays Arva's growth, Arva and Delaware specifically, in their role in population growth and settlement expansion and development in Middlesex Center. It also goes and gives some population context, in 2007, their population for ARVA was 550. Roughly residential units, when you take a look across the Middlesex Centre, about 1/3 number of residential units as compared to the population. So when you do that math, it comes out to about 180 residential units for ARVA. 10 residential units per year comes out to almost about 6% growth. So that's a fair amount, actually. It gives a fair amount of latitude. When we take a look at our growth, we're probably about, I think, 4%, 4 to 5% in terms of new builds. When we take a look at our recent build reports over the past couple months, population growth being about 1.2 to 2% at the most. Right. So I really don't think we're inhibiting too much through the current arrangement. That's what I was kind of curious to take a look at and see if we could get a sense of what does 10 mean to that community. It means about 6%. Now, that said, it was 10 years ago, so there are probably a few more, and maybe that drops it down to about 4 to 5% by ratio. Still, I don't think it's a significant impact on them. I think I have a desire to correct some of the historic hangovers from the agreement. I agree with Councillor Helmer's position. I don't really feel that I want to try and impose extraterritorial conditions upon growth. However, I think we also want to take a look and say, all right, let's find that right balance. ARVA has always been a weird one as I've watched city building and living in London, because ARVA is this kind of that bedroom community on the edge of London that is right there, and sometimes you can't tell where's London and where's ARVA, right? So, I mean, I would like to see us go back and try to figure out how to correct some of those, specifically with the DCs, with the rate charges, those kind of things, so that the financing agreement looks a lot more like what a financing agreement associated with such a servicing thing. Understanding that the sole purpose of this pipe is to protect environment and provide that small opportunity for growth that is reasonable. Through the rest of their official plan here, it talks about, well, if that servicing is not available, then we'll allow it to be unserviced, but with certain considerations. I'd much rather have it serviced than unserviced. The impacts of unserviced lands, especially on our headwaters, as they come into the city, it can be, well, it could have problems, I think, to say it bluntly. So myself, I'm with Councillor Park, I think, with the chair, in terms of could we take a look and say, what does that look like? At the end, it ends up being our discretion whether we want to get involved in that or not. Certainly at the beginning of all of this, I'm like, why are we even touching this? And Councillor Hopkins talks about like, why are we still involved in this, right? But we're involved. We've got a pipe. We put a pipe there. We put the infrastructure there. We're protecting the environment. To pull out of that kind of reneges on an agreement that we've put with them, and would also precipitate the removal of infrastructure, which I can't really see as being practical or feasible. So ultimately, I'd fall with Councillor Park on that. I'm still interested to hear anything that might dissuade me on that, and I would go to my colleagues as well.
Okay, Brown, Hopkins, Cassidy.
I mean, as always, a very good debate, and I think there will be some disagreement here no matter which way the debate goes. But I want to talk about a couple of things that have been said, and I say this respectfully. I don't see this as being like a big sibling or condescending in any way, because I think that this municipality has the right to grow and make decisions any way that they choose. The complicating factor is that they're asking to use our wastewater treatment facility in order to do so. And that's the difference, I think. When I compare this to, as Councillor Turner pointed out, the decision that we made early in the term as a council with regard to industrial lands, that was really a situation where there was no impact to our community other than potentially a positive impact, which is more industry moving to southwestern Ontario. And there can be some good secondary and tertiary benefits that are associated with that. kind of activity happening. But I gotta go back to the urban growth boundary. And if we had proponents in our own community who came to us, this council, I think specifically, who came to us and said, we've got a great idea. We just need you to put a pipe across the street. I own some property within the municipality of London and I want to grow. And it's a very efficient way to grow. We'd say no. We would say no, I think, because of our commitment to the London plan, because of our commitment to grow in a much more dense way, because of our commitment to 45% infill. And I guess I hear the economic argument that this cap is putting some kind of controls over competition. But again, the complicating factor is that this whole service was introduced on an emergency basis for an environmental purpose. And a cap was introduced at 10 as a very modest cap, as Councillor Turner points out, is perhaps one that was very appropriate, so that there couldn't be an unintended consequence connected to doing the right thing. Doing the right thing was ensuring that we were protecting our environment. The unintended consequence is creating competition that wouldn't have been there had we not done the right thing. Because 184 homes built in Arva are 184 homes that aren't built in London. Most rural communities, it's true, they're very different, but this is right on the border of London. And I've got to believe that we have a lot of back and forth with the families and individuals that live in this community and the ones that would be moving here. Loss of development charge, I know it's not a profit center, but there are those softer costs associated with development charges like police and fire and, well, that's to a lesser extent, but parks and arenas and libraries. And we have reciprocal agreements with our rural neighbors to have access to these things. And so this is a situation where there is no net gain in population. The same number of people will be moving to this area, whether we approve this or not, but this could be, to fit in the direction that we go, 50 homes that locate outside of London in an area that had they been inside our border but outside our urban growth boundary, we wouldn't approve, instead of 50 homes that could very well have been helping us reach that 45% infill. And so for all of those reasons, particularly because this has a direct impact on Londoners, this decision, if we were to move forward in a negative way. I say very sensitively to our neighbors, but I continue to think that no, that's not the answer. This was a solution that we developed to address a very serious environmental problem, and I don't want it to become the thin edge of the wedge that introduces a series of other issues that we need to deal with because we did the right thing so long ago.
Thank you. Councillor Hopkins.
Thank you. And I know when I read this, I thought, why are we doing this? And it came to planning, and I always appreciate the debate because I always like to put the thoughts that I have, open them up and put them in, see another point of view, and I'm still not convinced here. I have not heard that by increasing it, that we're, I still don't understand why we would do it. We're already doing the neighborly thing. We're going to be giving them the assessment growth, where I think we need the assessment growth. Councillor Turner really spoke well to assessment growth and the need for sort of helping the development here in London. I do think that other areas that can be bedroom areas like Komoka, for instance, right next to Ward 9, if they came to us and wanted this kind of an agreement, I'm sure we would not be saying, yes, do it. But yet, as Komoka is developing in that area, the subdevelopments are just booming out there. They are coming into the city, using our roads. The congestions on our roads coming into the city have increased, and we feel it. But yet, you know, we were able to maintain and take on that expansion in our rural communities. I don't like the idea of getting involved where, like I said, we've already done the neighborly thing, and if option one means to continue doing that neighborly thing, I'm fine with that.
Councillor Cassidy.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just want to sort of go off of what Councillor Hopkins said as well. And as far as meddling in our neighbors' affairs, I think this is the opposite of meddling. There's a difference in telling our neighbors what they can and can't do and providing London services to allow them to do it more easily. Nobody is stopping them from growing. Nobody is stopping them from development. We're just saying, provide your own services to do that growth and development. They can go ahead at any point and using their tax base, their property tax base, or whatever funding they can put in place to see this any development take place. London's not stopping them from doing it. Exactly as Councillor Hopkins says, as if any other community came to us and said, we want to tap into your infrastructure, we want to tap into your water and wastewater treatment systems so that we can build a new subdivision right on the outskirts of London, I'm pretty sure we would most likely say no. The impetus for this particular servicing was an environmental issue, and the province asked us to get involved and to provide this to save an environmental crisis that was taking place in the Medway Creek. So it made sense for the City of London to step in and because we all share the water. So if the water is being polluted in a neighboring community, eventually it will affect London and Londoners as well. And do we see sprawl continuing to take place within London's boundaries? Absolutely we do. By speaking out against this particular kind of sprawl does not make us guilty of hypocrisy, because there are costs associated with sprawl. We all know it. There are costs with this kind of development, the hard costs like the infrastructure, the roads and all of that sort of thing. But there are environmental costs that are often talked about as well when we talk about sprawl development. And so the problem here is that the hard costs that we can recoup through development charges, we're not able to recoup, as has been said numerous times tonight, and I've said it as well. But as well, those environmental costs, it's ironic that we would be encouraging sprawl development, encouraging costs to the environment, when the original reason for having this servicing in place was to deal with an environmental problem. So I see the irony there, and I hope that other people do as well. So, as I said, London is not meddling in this situation. The difference in the industrial land one and the OMB appeal on that one was by going to the OMB, we were, in a sense, indirectly telling our neighbors what we felt they could and couldn't do with their land within their boundaries. This is completely the opposite. This is not London not telling Middlesex Centre what to do. This is just simply saying, we have an agreement in place and we're going to keep the agreement the way it is because we don't feel that we should expand servicing in this area for this reason.
Okay, any further speakers at this time? Okay, I would just like to raise a couple points, and I'll get clarification from Mr. Yeoman, but it's my understanding that right now the flow limitations are really putting the cap on the growth speed. And if we went forward with option 2, the growth itself would take a shorter amount of time, but the costs associated with the city's aspect would be the same. But going back to the table gives us the opportunity to talk about, okay, we're going to update the cost of taking the sanitary water back in, because right now we're doing the bulk thing, right? So we're not doing it at a way that it's making the costs. We're not meeting the costs at this point. And also going back to the table gives us the opportunity to get Middlesex Centre to actually pay for the cost of growth, because right now it's on our dime, looking forward to what that cost and how those two balance, because right now it doesn't balance on behalf of Londoners. We're paying the tab for the growth going on in north of the border there. So if I get some clarification on those points, it'd be very helpful. And I believe I missed an opportunity. Councillor Turner asked a question, Mr. Mathers, and you had an answer, and hopefully you can wrap it all up into this.
Through the chair, I just want to take a step back and talk about those two costs that we've been really focusing on, because I want to provide some context of the magnitude of those costs. And firstly, I'm not putting any judgment on this. It does come down to fairness, and I think that's a very important consideration. So currently, Middlesex Center, their ARVA settlement uses approximately 100,000. Revenue from that center is $111,000 per year as of last year. There's currently a significant capacity to be able to take their flows. They have this cap of 175 meters cubed per day, and they're currently using about 90 meters cubed per day. So we do have significant additional capacity within what they had constructed to be able to pump to the City of London. On the development charges side, I've given a very high-level calculation of that as well. So if we're looking at trying to allow for those additional 39 units, it's approximately $175,000 in lost revenue as well. So I just want to provide that context of those two pieces. If we were to move to charging based on, instead of using the large user rate, moving to charging based on population. I've done some really back of the napkin calculations for this because I don't know how many users, what the size of their meters would be and all those types of things. But firstly, I'd like to state that they are being charged the 2017 rates for water and sewer. So that changing from time to time, we do change it, and it's annually. So if we were to look at going from that $111,000 and then making a change, my high-level estimate is it would approximately double. So going from that 111 to about 200 to 250,000, just based on some very rudimentary calculations. If you have any other further questions regarding that, I'm happy to answer them.
Councillor Turner?
Thank you, and thank you, Mr. Mathers. That's incredibly helpful if you were to take a look at the balance sheet on that, if you're anybody keeping score, in terms of property tax revenue lost associated with 10 new houses of about $3,000 to $4,000 per year in property taxes. That comes out to about $30,000 to $40,000 a year compared to about the $100,000 in revenue shortfall that we're seeing on water from the current ARVA agreement. So if we're looking at the opportunity cost and on houses not built in London lost to ARVA at 10 per year, I'd argue that the economics doesn't quite work on that. I'm concerned when we're talking 10 units per year, that we consider that as material in terms of impact on London's development itself. And I'd rather not look at this from a London development perspective, but rather if we're making agreements and arrangements with through any of our growth programs, that we're doing them in a way that's on a sustainable and cost recovered basis. I mean, it's just good economics, right? And that's not happening here. If we did the same thing with any developer, we'd be in a lot of trouble. The question about, and we've had discussions about extending pipes out to rural settlements, and the answer is no. It's pretty clear, it's no. The thing is, right here, there's a pipe there. They're, one way or another, they can grow as a municipality. Environmentally, it makes a ton more sense to put it all into one pipe and process it at a sewage treatment plant in an appropriate way with secondary and in some cases tertiary sewage treatment rather than through septic beds. So I think it's, it sounds and it looks like we've got a fairly split council here, committee here, and I don't anticipate swaying anybody, but I think it's certainly worth at least taking a look and saying, what would such an agreement look like? What would the impacts to us be? And I think that's a very fair point for us to consider. If there is an impact, fine. Then we can walk away and just say, let everything status quo persists. If there's a net negative impact, that we'd certainly want to walk away from that. If there is a net positive impact in both our growth pattern, in our cost recovery, and in our agreement and our relationship with our neighbor, all of those things, I think there's an opportunity to at least see what that is, and I think it's worth at least testing that.
Councillor Cassidy and then Hopkins.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Okay, two things. Number one, I'm wondering if we could get in time for council next week, some kind of a chart to show all those costs that Mr. Mathers provided to us so we can weigh that. Secondly, what are the risks in opening this up, in saying we want to enter renegotiation? What are the risks to the city? Like, let's say we decide, no, we don't like their negotiating stance, and can we still go back to the original agreement? I know I'm asking you to predict the future, but I would just like to know if you have an idea of the risks there.
Mr. Barrett?
Through the chair, certainly, I mean, you'd probably want to speak with your legal folks, but the agreement is your agreement. It takes two parties to sign it. So you have an existing agreement that has current terms. And I would suggest to you that that would be the default if it's not working. You have an agreement in place. This is looking at whether or not you would bring forward a new agreement that would amend those conditions.
Okay, thank you, Madam Chair. So, I might be amenable to staff looking at coming up with something better. My stumbling block are constituents in Ward 5 that are still on septic system and want city services, and they speak to me at every opportunity, and I have a hard time, despite all the logical arguments that my colleagues make, I have a very hard time saying, yeah, okay, let's extend city services to non-London residents when I have London residents living around the block from me, literally, like Masonville Mall area. They're just up from Loblaws there. It's like total urban part of the city. It's not outskirt area, and they're still on septic system. So that is my remaining stumbling block.
Okay, Councillor Hopkins, then Helmer.
I hear you, Councillor Cassidy, because I have the same concerns in my ward, and I guess I'm just going to go back because I'm trying to be open to persuasion here. Going back to option number 2, can we walk away? I've heard from Councillor Park saying, that there could be other options coming out of the discussions on this agreement. If we pick option 2, what does that look like? Or can we walk away and go back to option 1? I know we can get legal advice, but if you can help out a little bit more.
Mr. Fleming.
Well, Madam Chair, I think that coming out of this meeting, if you're saying, take a look and pursue option 2 and then bring it back to us, what that does is it says, okay, locking the agreement in as it has been to 10 units per year is something that you may be willing to move from. Option 2 would mean that they could do 50 in an individual year. That would be the maximum, but that would have to be for a 5-year period. Right now, they can't do that. They can only do 10 units per year and then 10 units the next year. So that makes it very difficult for them under those conditions to build out a subdivision 10 units at a time, just as logistically and from a viability and marketability perspective, very difficult. So what we would do is we'd be able to pursue that, see where it lands, come back to you, and then you would have the opportunity to either move forward with it, make changes to what we've come up with, or just decide that you don't want to go down that road at all. So you have lots of options. This is just giving us some direction. And you can see why we wanted to come forward to get some direction from you, because it's so complex and it really is a political decision to a large degree. And then we can bring forward that technical perspective and you can make your decision at that point. So there's no decision that you're getting locked into today. You're giving us some direction so we understand where you're at, and council subsequently where your heads are at, and then we can move forward on that basis.
Mr. Mathers.
And just to add to that, looking at what the worst-case scenario is, if they decided to cease the relationship, ARVA, cease their relationship with us, they do have that option. They can control their own destiny. I've pulled up their 2017 development charges study, and they have included in that study the cost to do an EA for a wastewater treatment facility in ARVA for 2018 is the timing on it. So they do have that ability. So in not having this agreement, there is that possibility that they could move forward with their own options. And if you look at what they've done in Delaware, it's very similar to what they've done in Delaware, where they had an option to keep their servicing with the city, and they've decided not to take it and to go their own way.
Thank you. On the list, I've got Councillor Hopkins, Helmer, and then Mayor Brown.
Okay. Thank you, colleagues. I think the discussion has been very good. I appreciate the sort of variety of opinions. I think we've covered sort of the major sort of pros and cons of different directions we could go on this decision. I just want to clarify with Mr. Mathers the figures he was giving out. I know you're just giving them back of a napkin, but we're talking about two different kinds of servicing, the water servicing and the wastewater servicing, and we're talking about different geography. Sometimes it's Middlesex Center, sometimes it's this specific community, sometimes it's a different specific community. So could you just say exactly what the numbers you were giving were for? Was that for Middlesex Center wastewater, Middlesex Center water, ARVA wastewater, just to clarify?
Through the chair, those were just for ARVA. I do have the cost for the other different hamlets as well. So sorry, just for ARVA. And then the 111,000 was for both water and wastewater. The wastewater cost is 44,000 and the water is 67,000. That was for 2016 numbers.
Okay, I appreciate that. Thank you.
Mayor?
Thanks very much. Through you, Chair, to the comment that Mr. Mathers made about the potential of a community on our outskirts developing their own wastewater treatment plant. That could happen one way or the other. I mean, the decision that we're making today isn't going to influence that decision. It could happen independently, and it should. Based on where we are with this discussion today, and I think it was a great discussion, I'm going to stay consistent today at committee and look to not take any further action. I think that it could very well be a split at committee. I think that's a good thing, because we have learned some new information based on some of the questions that have been asked by councillors of staff. And some of the numbers, I think, to use the words that I heard, where I've sort of worked this out in the back of a napkin. And I'd feel a whole lot more comfortable if we end up with a split decision here today, looking at those numbers between now and council, so we can get a really good sense of some of the finer details. I think also it's really important to point out that we've been presented with 3 options by staff, but we have a plethora of options. These options help, I think, guide the conversation, but we don't need to pick option 1, 2, or 3. And over the course of the next week, I know that particularly once I have that additional information, I'll be spending some time thinking about what might be a good approach for us to take. And it could still include that I'm remain with my decision to take no further action, because I think that there's a few more moving parts that we need to see between now and council. So, so I'll leave my comments there, and I'll look forward to a motion.
Councillor Turner, then Helmer.
I was just, for the sake of expediency, I put forward to option 2.
Sorry, moved by Councillor Turner, seconded by Councillor Helmer. We'll get that up on the screen. Councillor Helmer.
So one thing I want to just mention is I know that, especially with the figures that Mr. Mathers provided, that it seems like perhaps there's an opportunity to, increase the revenue that's coming to us through this agreement. Just putting myself in the shoes of Middlesex Center and the folks in ARVA, that obviously doesn't seem like a great idea to them. And those are residents who already are there and are already paying their water and wastewater bills, right? And we're talking about a very significant increase in their billing. And so as much as it might seem attractive, I don't think it's going very far because the other party's probably not going to be too interested in it. So, trading off the interests of the current residents versus the future residents in some future subdivision, I can see how that might go. And I'm willing to talk about it, but I don't know how promising it is.
Yeah.
Okay, the motion's up. Now you can. Magic of technology. Okay, any further speakers before we call the question? Seeing none, well, I'll call the question.
Closing the vote, the motion fails 3-3.
All right, so I predict we'll be talking about this at length next week. Councillor Helmer?
Can we just receive the report?
Okay, motion to receive the report moved by Councillor Helmer, seconded by Councillor Hopkins, waived by Mayor Brown. All those in favor? Because we'll just do it manually, why not? Oh, good old. Here it goes. Sorry, folks. Thought we'd be a little quicker there, but.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 6-0.
We have no deferred matters. Any additional business? Seeing none, we can take a motion to adjourn, moved by Councillor Cassidy, seconded by Councillor Helmer. All in favor? Have a great evening.